The diner smelled like burnt coffee and second chances, until the moment two men cornered Sophie Moore at the counter and reminded her that some things follow you, no matter how far you run. If you've ever had to start over in a town where nobody knows your name, where every smile feels like a test and every stranger might be the one who shatters your fragile new peace, then you understand what brought Sophie to Riverdale. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far Sophie's journey travels. P. Sophie's hands trembled as she set down her sketchbook, the half-finished design blurring before her eyes. The pencil rolled across the worn Formica counter at Maggie's place, coming to rest against her untouched club sandwich. Lunch hour in Riverdale usually felt safe, predictable even, with its rhythm of clinking silverware and the low hum of small-town conversation. But safety, Sophie had learned the hard way, was just another word for temporary. "Well, well, fancy seeing you here, sweetheart." The voice came from directly behind her, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke and stale beer. Sophie's spine went rigid. She didn't turn around. She'd spent the last 8 months training herself not to react, not to show fear, not to give men like this the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten under her skin. "I think you've got me confused with someone else." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, each word carefully measured. "Nah, I don't think so." A second voice, rougher than the first. "You're that designer girl, ain't you? Living above the bookstore on Maple. Real pretty setup you got there. We seen you coming and going." Sophie's breath caught. The bookstore. They knew where she lived, her fingers curled around the edge of the counter, knuckles going white. The careful architecture of her new life, the anonymous apartment, the quiet job at the design studio, the deliberate distance she kept from everyone, suddenly felt as substantial as tissue paper. "The lady said she doesn't know you." The new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, calm, measured, and carrying a weight that made the air in the diner shift. "Seems like a good time to move along." Sophie's eyes flicked to the mirror behind the counter. In its streaked surface, she could see them. The two men who'd been watching her for weeks from across the street, their interest growing bolder each time. And between them and her, a third figure had risen from a corner booth. A man with dark hair going silver at the temples, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested coiled readiness. "This ain't your business, old man." The first man, Reynolds, she'd heard someone call him once, stepped closer to Sophie, his hand reaching for her wrist. "We're just being friendly." "Daddy?" The small voice came from the corner booth where the man had been sitting. A little girl with dark curls and enormous brown eyes stood on the vinyl seat, her chocolate milk forgotten, concern written across her face in bold, unmistakable letters. "It's okay, Lilybug. Stay right there." The man's voice gentled when he spoke to his daughter, but his eyes never left Reynolds. "Sweetheart, I need you to be brave for about 30 seconds. Can you do that for me?" The little girl nodded, clutching a stuffed elephant to her chest. Everything happened in the space between heartbeats. Reynolds' fingers closed around Sophie's wrist, and then he was on the floor, his arm twisted at an angle that made Sophie's stomach turn. The second man lunged forward with a wild haymaker that never landed. The stranger, the father, moved with the kind of precision that spoke of muscle memory older and deeper than conscious thought. A deflection. A pivot. The second attacker's momentum carried him face first into the counter with a sickening crack. 14 seconds. Sophie would replay it in her mind later, counting the impossible brevity of violence. 14 seconds, and both men were on the ground, one clutching his arm and whimpering, the other out cold with blood streaming from his nose. The stranger straightened his flannel shirt, breathing easily, and turned to his daughter. "See? All done. Finish your milk, Lilybug." Sophie stared at him, her pulse hammering in her ears. The diner had gone silent except for Reynolds' groans and the distant sound of sirens. Someone must have called the police the moment trouble started. The man who'd just dropped two attackers without breaking a sweat was now sliding back into the booth, cutting his daughter's grilled cheese into triangles with the careful attention of someone performing surgery. "You okay, miss?" Maggie herself appeared at Sophie's elbow, her weathered face creased with concern. The diner's owner had seen everything in 40 years of business, but even she looked shaken. Lord have mercy. I told Sheriff Grant those two were trouble the first time they came in here. Yes, I think so. Sophie's wrist throbbed where Reynolds had grabbed her, but that was nothing compared to the adrenaline still flooding her system. She forced herself to look away from the man in the corner booth, even as questions multiplied in her mind like rabbits. The police arrived. Sheriff Grant and Deputy Williams, both men Sophie recognized from her careful observations of Riverdale's rhythms and routines. They took statements, called for an ambulance, and hauled Reynolds and his friend toward the waiting cruiser. The second man had regained consciousness and was loudly proclaiming his innocence to anyone who would listen. Mr. Cole, Sheriff Grant approached the corner booth with the careful respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. Need your statement. Not much to tell, Sheriff. Those two were harassing the lady. I asked them to stop. They didn't want to stop. The man, Cole, spoke in the same measured tone he'd used earlier, calm as a pond on a windless day. Rest kind of took care of itself. Uh-huh. Grant's weathered face suggested he'd heard this particular brand of understatement before. Took care of itself real efficiently. You hurt? No, sir. Them neither, mostly, considering. Grant's eyes swept the diner, taking in the lack of broken furniture, the absence of real damage beyond Reynolds' pride and his friend's bloody nose. Clean work. Cole said nothing, just cut another triangle of grilled cheese. All right then, you know the drill. Come by the station later, sign your statement. Grant tipped his hat to Sophie. Miss Moore, you'll want to come by too, and maybe think about a restraining order. Reynolds has been trouble since he rolled into town 6 months back. 6 months. The same amount of time Sophie had been in Riverdale, give or take a few weeks. The coincidence made her skin crawl. After the police left, the diner's normal rhythm tried to reassert itself, but conversation stayed muted and more than one set of eyes kept drifting toward the corner booth. Sophie found herself doing the same thing, watching the man named Cole as he patiently wiped chocolate milk from his daughter's chin, his hands gentle and sure. Those same hands had put 2 men on the ground in less time than it took to sneeze. The contradiction made her head spin. You should eat something. Maggie set down a fresh cup of coffee, steam rising in lazy spirals. On the house. Least I can do after you got caught up in all that ugliness. Thank you. Sophie wrapped her hands around the mug, seeking warmth even though the diner wasn't cold. Shock, she recognized distantly. Her body's delayed reaction to danger, to violence, to the sudden shattering of her carefully constructed sense of safety. She'd come to Riverdale because it was small, because it was quiet, because it was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. She'd come here to disappear, to rebuild herself into someone her ex-boyfriend Marcus couldn't find, couldn't manipulate, couldn't drag back into the suffocating cage of his love. But Reynolds and his friend had found her anyway. Or maybe they were just random predators who'd sensed vulnerability the way sharks sensed blood in water. Either way, the illusion of safety had cracked, and Sophie could feel the familiar panic starting to rise, the urge to pack her bags, to run again, to find another anonymous town and pray it worked out better than the last. Daddy, that lady is sad. The little girl's voice carried across the diner, innocent and concerned in the way only children could manage. Sophie looked up to find those enormous brown eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. Lily, we don't... Cole started, but his daughter was already scrambling out of the booth, stuffed elephant dangling from one hand. She crossed the diner with the fearless determination of someone who'd never learned that the world could be cruel, who still believed that kindness was the default setting of humanity. She stopped in front of Sophie's stool, barely tall enough to see over the counter, and held up the elephant. Mr. Trunk makes me feel better when I'm sad. You can hold him if you want. Sophie's throat closed. She looked down at the offered toy, its gray fabric worn soft from years of love, one ear slightly chewed, button eyes holding more wisdom than seemed possible for an inanimate object. When she spoke, her voice came out rough with unshed tears. That's very kind of you. What's your name? Lily Marie Cole. I'm 6 3/4. My daddy says that's almost 7, but I think quarters are important, so I always say them. She tilted her head, studying Sophie with the same intensity her father had used to assess the threat from Reynolds. Are you scared? Daddy says it's okay to be scared sometimes. Being brave means doing stuff even when you're scared. Your daddy sounds like a smart man. Sophie carefully accepted the elephant, holding it like the precious offering it was. I'm Sophie. And yes, I was a little scared, but I'm okay now. 'Cause Daddy stopped the bad men. Lily said this with absolute certainty, the kind of bedrock faith that came from 6 years of evidence that her father could fix anything, protect anyone, make the world safe with his bare hands. Lily. Cole appeared beside his daughter, and Sophie got her first clear look at him, really looked, not just the panicked glimpse from the mirror. He was maybe 35 with the kind of face that wore its years honestly. Weathered skin, crow's feet at the corners of gray-blue eyes, a nose that had been broken at least once and healed slightly crooked. His hair needed cutting, curling slightly at his collar, and there was a scar running along his left jawline, thin and white with age. But it was his eyes that caught her. Quiet eyes, watchful. The kind of eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing, that had witnessed things Sophie couldn't imagine and carried the weight without complaint. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice held genuine regret. She's friendly. Too friendly, probably. I'm working on boundaries. It's fine, really. Sophie managed a smile, genuine despite everything. She's lovely. She's a menace. But the words came wrapped in affection, so thick Sophie could practically touch it. Cole rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder, and Lily leaned into it automatically, the easy intimacy of a child who'd never doubted she was loved. Come on, Lilybug. We need to let Miss Sophie finish her lunch. But she didn't eat any of it. Lily pointed at the untouched sandwich with the prosecutorial precision of someone who took meal completion seriously. Daddy says you gotta eat to have energy. She's not gonna have energy if she doesn't eat. Lily. What? It's true. Sophie found herself laughing, the sound surprising her as much as anyone. It felt rusty, unpracticed, like a door hinge that hadn't been oiled in months. But it also felt good, a release of the tension that had been building in her chest since Reynolds first spoke. You know what? Your daughter's absolutely right. I should eat. She picked up half the sandwich, took a deliberate bite, chewed and swallowed while Lily watched with satisfaction. Better? Better, Lily nodded firmly, then turned to her father. Can we come back tomorrow? I like it here, and I think Miss Sophie might need Mr. Trunk again. We'll see. Cole's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter, and Sophie saw something shift in his face. A glimpse of the man behind the controlled exterior, the father who would move heaven and earth for this little girl. Go grab your backpack, okay? We need to get you to dance class. Lily scampered off, and for a moment, Sophie and Cole stood in awkward silence. She should thank him. She knew that. Should say something about what he'd done, about the casual display of violence that had saved her from whatever Reynolds and his friend had planned. But the words wouldn't come. The sheriff wasn't kidding about that restraining order. Cole spoke quietly, his eyes tracking his daughter's movements even as he addressed Sophie. Reynolds has a record: assault, intimidation, drunk, and disorderly. Came here from 2 towns over after wearing out his welcome. You'll want protection, legal protection, until they're locked up for good. How do you know all that? The question came out sharper than Sophie intended. Small town. People talk. He paused, seemed to consider his next words carefully. And I asked around when I saw them watching you, a couple weeks back. Figured it wasn't friendly interest. Sophie's stomach dropped. You saw them watching me? Hard to miss. They weren't subtle. His jaw tightened, a flash of something darker crossing his features before he buried it. Should have said something sooner. Thought maybe I was reading it wrong, that it wasn't my place. That was a mistake. I'm sorry. The apology caught her off guard. Men like Marcus never apologized. They justified, explained, turned their failures into her fault. But this stranger, this man who'd just put 2 people on the ground with the efficiency of a professional, stood in Maggie's diner and took responsibility for something that wasn't even his burden to carry. It's not your fault, Sophie heard herself say. You don't even know me. Don't need to know you to recognize trouble. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the conversation in a way he hadn't been uncomfortable with the violence. Riverdale's a good town, quiet, safe, mostly. Don't let this scare you off. Before Sophie could respond, Lily came thundering back, backpack bouncing against her shoulders, still clutching Mr. Trunk. She pressed the elephant into Sophie's hands one more time. Just for today. Tomorrow you can give him back. Daddy says making promises means you gotta keep them, so I promise I'll see you tomorrow to get him. She beamed up at Sophie with the kind of smile that could melt glaciers. Pinky promise? Sophie found herself extending her pinky, letting this tiny force of nature wrap her smaller finger around it, sealing a contract that felt more binding than any legal document she'd ever signed. Pinky promise. Okay, Bug, let's go. Cole steered his daughter toward the door, then paused, looking back at Sophie. If you need anything, if Reynolds comes around again, or if you just feel unsafe, Maggie has my number. Don't hesitate. And then they were gone, the door chiming behind them, leaving Sophie alone with a stuffed elephant, a cold sandwich, and about 1,000 questions she couldn't begin to answer. The Riverdale Sheriff's Office occupied a squat brick building on the corner of Main and 3rd, wedged between the hardware store and a law office that had been closed since its owner retired to Florida. Sophie pushed through the door 2 hours after the incident at Maggie's, still carrying Mr. Trunk, because leaving him felt like breaking a promise to Lily. Sheriff Grant looked up from a mountain of paperwork, his expression shifting from bureaucratic fatigue to weary sympathy when he saw her. Miss Moore, glad you came in. Coffee? No, thank you. Sophie settled into the chair across from his desk, hyper-aware of the stained carpet, the flickering fluorescent light, the wanted posters covering one wall like wallpaper. You said something about a restraining order? Yeah, good news is Reynolds and his buddy, name's Craig Mitchell, turns out, they're being held on assault charges. Judge set bail high enough they'll probably sit until trial. Grant pulled a folder from the chaos of his desk. Bad news is, trial could take months, and even after they're convicted, they'll get out eventually. That's where the restraining order comes in. Sophie's hands tightened on Mr. Trunk. What exactly did they want? Why were they watching me? Grant's expression darkened. Can't say for certain until we finish questioning them, but Reynolds had your address written down in his wallet, and Mitchell had pictures on his phone, you coming out of your apartment, walking to work, sitting in that coffee shop on Maple Street. The room tilted. Sophie gripped the armrests, fighting the nausea rising in her throat. Pictures. How many pictures? Dozens. Going back at least 3 weeks. Grant's voice gentled. Miss Moore, I need to ask, is there anyone from your past who might have hired these men? An ex-boyfriend, maybe? Someone with a reason to track your movements? Marcus. His name hung in the air between them, unspoken but present as a ghost. Sophie had left him 14 months ago, had changed her phone number, closed her social media accounts, moved 3 times before landing in Riverdale. She'd done everything the domestic violence counselor suggested, had followed every protocol for disappearing from an abusive relationship. But Marcus had money. Marcus had connections. And Marcus had never been good at accepting no. Maybe. The word felt like glass in her mouth. I had a boyfriend. In Chicago. It ended badly. He didn't want it to end. Badly how? Grant's pen hovered over his notepad, patient and professional. Sophie closed her eyes, forcing herself to articulate the reality she'd spent over a year trying to escape. He was controlling, jealous, started tracking my phone, showing up at my work, isolating me from friends. When I finally left, he told me I'd regret it, that I'd never get away from him, that he'd find me wherever I went. Did you file a police report? Get a restraining order in Chicago? I tried. But Marcus. His family has money, influence. The lawyers made it sound like I was overreacting, being dramatic. The judge denied the restraining order, said there wasn't enough evidence of physical threat. The old bitterness rose in her chest, acid and familiar. So I ran instead. Grant nodded slowly, writing notes in his careful copperplate handwriting. I'll make some calls, see if Chicago PD has any record of your ex making threats, hiring investigators. In the meantime, we'll get you that restraining order against Reynolds and Mitchell. It's not perfect, but it's something. Thank you. Sophie stood, suddenly desperate to be out of the small office with its walls of wanted faces and its implicit reminder that danger could wear any face, come from any direction. Did Mr. Cole already give his statement? Ethan? Yeah. Came in about an hour ago. In and out in 15 minutes. Grant's expression shifted, something between respect and wariness. That man's got skills. Military training, I'd bet my pension on it. Saw combat, probably saw a lot of it. Don't get moves like that from a YouTube video. Ethan. So that was his first name. Ethan Cole, single father, defender of strangers, man of efficient violence and gentle hands. Should I be worried about him? The question came out awkwardly, but Sophie needed to know. She'd spent too long with Marcus learning that protection could be another word for possession, that a man's strength could be used to cage as easily as to defend. Grant considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. Known Ethan 6 years since he moved here right after his wife passed. He's quiet, keeps to himself mostly except for Lily. Works construction, does good work. Never caused trouble, never started a fight. He paused. But he's finished a few. 3 times in 6 years, always the same situation. Someone threatening somebody weaker. A drunk getting handsy at the harvest festival. Teenagers harassing old Mrs. Chen outside the grocery store. And now this. 3 times in 6 years doesn't sound like much. It's not. That's my point. Grant's eyes met hers, sharp and assessing. Ethan Cole's not looking for fights. But when they find him, they end fast and clean. No excessive force, no showboating, just enough to stop the threat and not one bit more. That's discipline. That's training. And that's a man who knows exactly how dangerous he is and keeps it locked down tight. Sophie thought about this, about the contrast between Ethan's explosive competence against Reynolds and his careful gentleness cutting grilled cheese for his daughter, about the scar on his jaw and the quiet sorrow in his eyes, about a man who'd lost his wife and was raising a little girl who believed her daddy could fix the world. He seems like a good father, she said finally. Best one I've seen. Grant's expression softened. That little girl, Lily, she's his whole world. Everything he does for her, making sure she has stability, safety, normalcy. He turned down a job in Chicago last year, better pay and everything, because it would have meant uprooting her. That's the kind of man Ethan is. Sophie nodded, filing this information away with all the other pieces of the puzzle that was Ethan Cole. I should go. Thank you for your help, Sheriff. Miss Moore? Grant called as she reached the door. Ethan's good people. One of the best. Don't let what you saw today scare you. A man who can fight like that and chooses not to most of the time. That's someone you can trust. The words followed Sophie out into the late afternoon sunshine, mixing with her own tangled thoughts about safety and danger, about the difference between a man who could hurt you and a man who wouldn't. Sophie's apartment sat above Riverdale Books and Brew, a combination bookstore and coffee shop run by an elderly couple who'd moved here from Portland seeking small-town charm. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, a living room that doubled as her design studio, but it had high ceilings and big windows that flooded the space with light. More importantly, it had felt safe. Past tense, she thought bitterly, as she climbed the exterior stairs, keys already in hand, because now she knew that Reynolds and Mitchell had been watching, photographing, cataloging her movements. The sanctuary she'd built had been compromised before she'd even finished unpacking. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning, laptop open on the makeshift desk, coffee mug still half full and cold, sketches scattered across the floor in the organized chaos that passed for her creative process. But it all looked different now, contaminated by the knowledge of unwanted eyes, malicious interest. Sophie locked the door, threw the deadbolt, and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Then she sank onto the couch, Mr. Trunk clutched to her chest, and let herself shake. She'd been so careful. So damn careful. New name on the lease, cash-only transactions for the first month, no social media presence. She'd even changed her appearance, cut her long blonde hair into a pixie cut, traded contacts for glasses, swapped her Chicago wardrobe of designer pieces for Riverdale's casual practicality. But it hadn't been enough. Somehow, somewhere, she'd slipped up. Or maybe Marcus was just that determined, that resourceful, that unwilling to accept defeat. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Sophie's stomach clenched, but she answered anyway. Silence would only confirm that he'd found her. Sophie Moore? A woman's voice, professional and crisp. Speaking. This is Jennifer Walsh from Chicago Legal Aid. I'm calling regarding your inquiry from last year about restraining order protocols and protective services for domestic violence survivors. Sophie's breath caught. She'd reached out to legal aid during her final months with Marcus, desperate for help, for options, for someone to tell her she wasn't crazy for being afraid. The consultation had ended with gentle sympathy and the hard truth that without physical evidence, without witnesses, her word against Marcus's money would never be enough. I remember, but that was over a year ago. Why are you calling now? Because we received a query this afternoon from the Riverdale Sheriff's Office requesting your case files. When I pulled them, I noticed some concerning patterns I should have flagged the first time. Papers rustled in the background. Your ex-boyfriend, Marcus Vance, did you know his father owns a private investigation firm? Vance Security Solutions. They specialize in asset recovery and surveillance. The room spun. Sophie pressed a hand to her mouth, swallowing bile. No, I didn't know. I'm sorry, I should have connected those dots when we first spoke. But here's why I'm calling now. VSS has a reputation. Not a good one. Off-the-books jobs mostly. Tracking people who don't want to be found. They've been investigated twice by the Illinois Attorney General's office. No charges filed, but enough smoke to suggest fire. You're saying Marcus hired his father's company to find me. I'm saying it's extremely likely. And if that's the case, Sophie, a restraining order in Riverdale isn't going to be enough. You need to file a formal complaint against VSS, get federal involvement if possible. Interstate stalking, violation of privacy, there are laws that might actually help you now. Sophie's mind raced, connecting dots, building a case. Reynolds and Mitchell, watching her for weeks. The photographs on Mitchell's phone, Marcus's parting threat that she'd never escape him. What do I do? Her voice came out small, defeated. First, do not try to handle this alone. Contact a lawyer. I can send you names of attorneys who specialize in stalking cases. Second, document everything. Every sighting, every weird feeling, every time you think you're being followed. Third, consider moving again. I know that's not what you want to hear, but no. The word came out harder than Sophie intended. No more running. I'm done running. Walsh was quiet for a moment. Okay, then we dig in. I'll start pulling records, building a case. But Sophie, you need to understand, going up against the Vance family means going to war. They have resources, connections, lawyers who make a sport of crushing people like us. Are you sure you're ready for that? Sophie looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd built here. The design contracts that were finally starting to come in. The comfortable anonymity of a town where people knew her face but not her history. The possibility, fragile and new, of friendship with a 6-year-old who believed stuffed elephants could heal sadness and a father whose quiet strength felt like the opposite of Marcus's suffocating control. I'm sure, she said. After Walsh hung up with promises to send paperwork and attorney recommendations, Sophie sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, Mr. Trunk still tucked against her chest. She thought about Lily's pinky promise, about the casual way Ethan had told her to call if she needed anything, about Sheriff Grant's assessment of a man who knew how to fight but chose not to. She thought about Marcus, about the years she'd spent making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening, about the way she'd learned to anticipate his moods, to manage his jealousy, to accept blame for his anger. And she thought about the moment in Maggie's diner when Ethan Cole had stood up, not because Sophie had asked, not because he expected anything in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Maybe Riverdale had more than one kind of safety to offer. Maybe the kind that mattered most wasn't about hiding, wasn't about making herself invisible and hoping the monsters passed her by. Maybe it was about standing still long enough to let good people stand with you. Sophie pulled out her laptop, opened a new document, and began to write down everything she could remember about Marcus, about the relationship, about the warning signs she'd ignored, and the red flags she'd rationalized. Evidence. Documentation. The building blocks of a case that might finally set her free. Tomorrow she'd return Mr. Trunk to Lily. Tomorrow she'd thank Ethan properly for what he'd done. Tomorrow she'd start building the kind of life that didn't require running. But tonight she'd do the hard work of remembering, of naming the fear, of preparing for war. Outside her window, Riverdale settled into its evening routine. Streetlights flickering on, shops closing, Families gathering for dinner. Normal life, continuing despite everything. Sophie watched it all, and for the first time in months, she let herself hope that one day she might be part of that normalcy. One day. But first, she had to survive tomorrow. The morning came too early, dragging Sophie from fitful sleep filled with shadowy figures and locked doors that wouldn't open. She'd spent half the night documenting her relationship with Marcus, each memory a fresh wound reopened, and the other half staring at her ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building and wondering if Reynolds and Mitchell had friends. Her phone showed 6:30 when she finally gave up on sleep. Downstairs, she could hear the bookstore owners, Carol and Jim, moving around, preparing to open. The familiar sounds should have been comforting. Instead, they reminded her how thin the walls were, how easily someone could climb those exterior stairs, how vulnerable she'd been all along without knowing it. Sophie dressed in yesterday's jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, then picked up Mr. Trunk from where he'd spent the night on her pillow. The elephant's button eyes seemed to hold a question she couldn't quite answer. "Here goes nothing," she told him, and headed downstairs. Maggie's place looked different in the gentle light of early morning, softer somehow, less scarred by the previous day's violence. The breakfast crowd hadn't arrived yet, just a handful of regulars nursing coffee and reading newspapers at scattered tables. Sophie scanned the room automatically, a new habit she suspected would become permanent, but neither Ethan nor Lily were among the early risers. "You're up early." Maggie appeared at her elbow, coffee pot in hand. "Couldn't sleep?" Something like that. Sophie slid onto the same stool she'd occupied yesterday. Muscle memory or masochism, she couldn't say which. "Is it too early for breakfast?" "Honey, it's never too early for breakfast. That's practically our motto." Maggie poured coffee without asking, the steam rising between them like a peace offering. "The usual?" Sophie didn't have a usual. She'd only been coming to Maggie's for a few weeks. But the assumption of familiarity, the implication that she belonged here enough to have patterns and preferences, loosened something in her chest. "Sure, the usual sounds perfect." Maggie's smile said she understood the subtext, the desperate grasp at normalcy. "Coming right up. And honey, those men from yesterday, they're not getting out anytime soon. Sheriff Grant made sure of that. You're safe here." The words were meant to comfort, but they highlighted the fundamental problem. Safety was always conditional, always temporary. Sophie had been safe in Chicago too, until she wasn't. She'd been safe in the two towns she'd tried before Riverdale, until Marcus's reach found her anyway. But she smiled and nodded because Maggie meant well, because kindness deserved kindness in return, and because she was tired of being the woman who brought darkness into cheerful spaces. The door chimed. Sophie's shoulders tensed automatically before she registered the arrivals. Lily, practically vibrating with energy despite the early hour, and Ethan, looking like he hadn't slept much better than Sophie had. His eyes found hers immediately, a quick assessment that cataloged her presence, her posture, her state of mind, all in the span of a heartbeat. "Miss Sophie!" Lily broke away from her father, backpack bouncing, and made a beeline for Sophie's stool. "You came! Daddy said you might not come because it's really early, but I told him pinky promises are forever, and you seemed like someone who keeps promises." Sophie found herself smiling despite everything. "Your daddy was right to be skeptical, but you were right about the promise. I wouldn't break a pinky promise." "See?" Lily turned to Ethan with the triumphant expression of someone who'd won an important debate. "I told you." "You did." Ethan's voice carried the ragged edge of exhaustion, but his expression softened when he looked at his daughter. "And you were right. I should know better than to doubt you by now." He moved to the counter, maintaining a careful distance from Sophie that felt deliberate, not unfriendly but cautious, the space of someone who understood boundaries and respected them, even when circumstances had briefly erased them. "I wanted to thank you properly," Sophie said, the words coming out more formal than she intended, "for yesterday. Sheriff Grant told me you've given statements before, that it wasn't the first time you've stepped in." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Grant talks too much." "He talks the right amount." Sophie turned on her stool to face him fully, noting the fresh bruise on his knuckles that hadn't been there yesterday. "You got hurt." "This?" Ethan glanced at his hand dismissively. "Just a scrape. Mitchell had a harder head than expected. You should ice it." "I'm fine." The exchange had the rhythm of an old argument, though they'd never had one. Sophie recognized the deflection, the minimization of injury, the redirect away from personal vulnerability. She'd done the same thing countless times with Marcus, though for different reasons. He minimized to avoid responsibility, while Ethan seemed to minimize out of a bone-deep habit of bearing his burdens silently. "Mr. Trunk!" Lily's voice broke the tension, her attention zeroing in on the elephant tucked under Sophie's arm. "You brought him back. Did he help?" Sophie considered lying, then decided this child deserved honesty. "He did. I was scared last night, and having him there made me feel less alone, so thank you for lending him to me." Lily's face scrunched in thought, working through some internal calculation. Then she looked up at her father with the kind of determination that suggested she'd already made a decision and was simply informing the relevant authorities. "Daddy, I think Miss Sophie should keep Mr. Trunk for a while longer. She might get scared again, and we can't have a pinky promise every single day because that would be too many promises, and you said too many promises means you can't keep track of them all." Ethan crouched down to his daughter's level, bringing his eyes even with hers. The movement was practiced, natural, a father who'd learned that important conversations happened at 6-year-old height. "Lilybug, Mr. Trunk is your favorite. Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I have you so I don't get scared, but Miss Sophie doesn't have anybody, so she needs Mr. Trunk more than me." The logic was flawless in its simplicity, devastating in its accuracy. Sophie's throat closed. She wanted to protest, to explain that she was fine, that a grown woman didn't need a stuffed elephant, that Lily's generosity was touching but unnecessary. But the words stuck, tangled up with the truth that this child had seen right through her careful facade to the loneliness beneath. "Lily," Ethan said quietly, "that's very kind. But Miss Sophie might not want—" "I want," Sophie interrupted, her voice rougher than intended. "I mean, if you're sure, Lily, I'd be honored to keep Mr. Trunk safe for a while." Lily beamed, crisis averted, problem solved. She turned back to her father. "Can we sit with Miss Sophie, please? I want to tell her about my dance recital." Sophie watched Ethan's internal struggle play out across his features, the desire to give his daughter what she wanted warring with his instinct to maintain distance, to not impose, to respect the invisible boundaries that separated strangers from friends. Finally, he nodded. "If Miss Sophie doesn't mind the company, I don't mind." The words came out too fast, too eager, exposing the depth of her isolation. Sophie cleared her throat, tried again with more control. "I'd like that, actually." So Lily climbed onto the stool beside Sophie, swinging her legs and launching into an animated description of the upcoming dance recital that apparently involved tutus, a lot of spinning, and something called a grand jeté that sounded both impressive and dangerous. Ethan settled on Lily's other side, close enough to catch his daughter if she spun right off the stool in her enthusiasm, far enough to maintain that careful distance from Sophie. Maggie brought food, scrambled eggs and toast for Sophie, chocolate chip pancakes for Lily, and black coffee with wheat toast for Ethan. The simplicity of it, the domesticity, made Sophie's chest ache. This was what normal people did. They had breakfast, they talked about dance recitals and weekend plans. They existed in the world without constantly checking exits and cataloging threats. "So Miss Sophie," Lily said, around a mouthful of pancake that made her father wince, "what do you do? Daddy builds houses and fixes broken stuff. I'm going to be a dancer or maybe a veterinarian. I haven't decided yet." "I'm a designer. I help companies figure out what their websites and apps should look like, how people should use them." Lily's nose wrinkled. "That sounds like computer stuff. Do you like computers?" "I like solving puzzles, making things work better, look prettier. It's kind of like dance, actually. There's a right way and a wrong way, and when you get it right, everything flows." This explanation seemed to satisfy Lily, who nodded sagely and returned to her pancakes. But Sophie felt Ethan's attention sharpen, his quiet assessment becoming something more interested. "That's the work you were doing yesterday," he said, "at the diner. The sketches on your notebook." Sophie was surprised he'd noticed. In the chaos of Reynolds and Mitchell, in the aftermath of violence, he'd still registered the details of her work spread across the counter. A redesign for a local real estate company. They want something modern, but approachable. It's harder than it sounds. Most things are. Ethan took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. The hard part isn't making something look good. It's making it feel right, making people trust it enough to use it. The observation was more insightful than Sophie expected from someone who built houses for a living. She studied him more carefully. The calluses on his hands, the paint stain on his jeans, the weariness that went deeper than one sleepless night. You sound like you understand design. I understand building things that last. Same principle applies, form follows function, but both matter. He set down his coffee, seemed to realize he'd said more than intended, and redirected. How long have you been doing it? The design work? Since college. Almost 8 years now. Sophie pushed eggs around her plate, debating how much truth to share. I used to work for a big firm in Chicago, left about a year ago to freelance. It wasn't quite a lie. She had left Chicago, and she was freelancing now. She just omitted the part about running, about Marcus, about the way her career had been one more thing he'd tried to control and corrupt. Why Riverdale? The question was casual, but Sophie heard the real curiosity beneath it. Not exactly a design hub. That's why. Too much noise in the city, too many distractions. Too many ways for Marcus to find her, too many cameras and crowds and opportunities for surveillance. Here, I can focus. Build a client base without the overhead and stress. Ethan nodded slowly, and Sophie had the uncomfortable feeling he heard all the words she hadn't said, understood the careful construction of her half-truths. But he didn't push, didn't pry, just accepted her explanation and moved on. Daddy? Lily tugged on her father's sleeve. Can Miss Sophie come to my recital? It's on Saturday, and you said I could invite special people, and I think she's special. The request hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither adult wanted to examine too closely. Sophie watched Ethan's face, saw the war between his protective instincts and his daughter's happiness. Lily, we barely know Miss Sophie. She probably has plans. I don't, Sophie heard herself say. I don't have plans, and I'd love to come, if you're sure it's okay. Lily bounced on her stool, victory achieved. It's at the community center at 2 o'clock. You have to come early to get good seats because everybody comes and Mrs. Patterson says we're going to make our families so proud. Then I'll be there early. Sophie looked at Ethan, found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, caution mixed with something that might have been gratitude or possibly concern. If that's all right with your dad. It's your Saturday, Ethan said carefully, but Lily would be happy to have you there. Fair warning, though. 6-year-old dance recitals are long, loud, and involve a lot of sequins. Sounds perfect. And it did, in a way Sophie couldn't fully articulate. The normal chaos of childhood, the proud parents with cameras, the celebration of small accomplishments, it was so far removed from her current reality of restraining orders and surveillance photos that it felt like a glimpse into another dimension. They finished breakfast in companionable near silence, Lily filling any gaps with chatter about her best friend Emma and whether purple or pink tutus were objectively superior. When Maggie brought the check, Ethan reached for it automatically, but Sophie was faster. Let me. It's the least I can do. You don't owe me anything. His voice was firm, brooking no argument. I know, but I want to. Sophie met his eyes, held them. Please. Something shifted in his expression. Acceptance, maybe, or recognition that this mattered to her in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with autonomy, with being something other than a victim to be rescued. All right. Thank you. Such simple words, but they carried weight. Sophie paid the bill, feeling like she'd won some small battle in a war she was still learning to fight. They walked out into the crisp morning, the sun just starting to burn through the autumn haze. Lily skipped ahead, her backpack bouncing, while Ethan and Sophie followed at a more measured pace. About Saturday, Ethan said quietly, his words meant for Sophie alone. You don't have to come if you don't want to. Lily gets enthusiastic, and I know she can be overwhelming. She's not overwhelming. She's wonderful. Sophie adjusted Mr. Trunk under her arm, finding comfort in the worn fabric. And I meant it. I want to come. If that's weird, given that we just met, you can tell me. I won't be offended. It's not weird. Ethan's hands were shoved in his pockets, his gaze tracking Lily's progress down the sidewalk. Or maybe it is, but I don't mind. Lily doesn't make friends easily. Most kids find her too much, too intense. Seeing her connect with someone, even someone we barely know, it's good. She needs that. The admission felt like a gift, a glimpse behind the careful walls Ethan maintained. Sophie wanted to ask more, about Lily's mother, about the loss that Grant had mentioned, about how a man ended up raising a daughter alone in a small town far from wherever he'd learned to fight like that. But before she could formulate a question that wasn't invasive, Lily came running back, her face flushed with excitement. "Daddy! Daddy! Can we show Miss Sophie the park? The leaves are really pretty, and she might like it." Ethan glanced at Sophie, a question in his eyes. She should say no. She had work to do, emails to answer, a case to build against Marcus. Saturday's recital was already more involvement than was wise, and accepting further invitations meant crossing a line from grateful stranger to something approaching friendship. But Lily's hopeful face and the careful neutrality of Ethan's expression that said he wouldn't pressure her either way, and the fact that her apartment suddenly felt like a cage she didn't want to return to, all of it conspired to override Sophie's better judgment. "I'd like that," she said. "If you have time." "We have time." Ethan's small smile transformed his face, softening the hard edges and hinting at the man he might have been before whatever had carved those lines of sorrow into his features. "It's on the way to Lily's school anyway." So they walked, the three of them, through Riverdale's quiet morning streets. Lily maintained a running commentary on everything they passed: the bakery that made the best birthday cakes, the house where the mean dog lived, but he was actually nice if you gave him treats, the spot where she'd fallen off her bike and needed 3 Band-Aids. The park, when they reached it, was a small oasis of green tucked behind the elementary school. The trees were in full autumn glory, leaves painting the ground in shades of amber and crimson. A playground occupied one corner, empty at this hour, and a walking path circled a pond where ducks paddled in lazy circles. "It's beautiful," Sophie said, meaning it. "I've driven past but never stopped." "Most people don't." Ethan settled onto a bench that overlooked the pond, leaving room for Sophie while Lily ran to inspect the ducks. "It's the town's best-kept secret. Come evening, it's packed with families. But mornings, it's usually just us." Sophie sat, maintaining a respectful distance, watching Lily crouch at the pond's edge to study the ducks with scientific intensity. "How long have you been in Riverdale?" "Sheriff Grant mentioned 6 years. 6 years next month." Ethan's voice went flat, the way it had when Grant mentioned his wife. "Moved here when Lily was 6 months old. Needed somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. Somewhere that didn't have memories attached to every corner." "Where did you move from?" "Virginia Beach. I was stationed there." He said it simply, confirmation of Grant's suspicion about military background. "Naval Special Warfare. Did 12 years before I got out." The pieces clicked into place. The controlled violence, the instinctive threat assessment, the scars both visible and not. Sophie had read enough articles about veterans, about the ones who came home carrying wars in their bones, to recognize the signs. "That's where you learned," she said. Not a question. "That's where I learned a lot of things. How to fight, how to follow orders, how to trust your team with your life." His eyes stayed on Lily, never wavering. How to kill, if necessary. How to live with it after. The honesty stole Sophie's breath. Most people danced around their pasts, used euphemisms and careful omissions. But Ethan stated it plainly, without pride or shame, simple truth offered without expectation of judgment. "Why did you leave?" "Hannah died." 2 words, delivered in the same flat tone. "My wife." Brain aneurysm, out of nowhere. One minute she was laughing, holding Lily, planning what to make for dinner. Next minute she was gone. Just like that. Sophie's chest constricted. "I'm so sorry." "Everyone is." There was no bitterness in his voice, just exhausted acceptance. "But sorry doesn't change anything." She was still gone, and Lily still needed a parent who was present, who wasn't deployed 8 months out of the year. So I got out, took my honorable discharge, and found somewhere quiet to raise my daughter. That's the whole story. It wasn't the whole story. Sophie could see the pages he'd skipped, the chapters written in scar tissue and sleepless nights. But it was all he was willing to share, and she understood that kind of self-protection intimately. "She's lucky to have you," Sophie said. "Lily, you're a good father." "I'm trying." Ethan's expression softened as Lily waved at them from the pond's edge, triumphantly holding up a feather she'd found. "Some days I have no idea what I'm doing, but I show up and I try. And I hope that's enough." They sat in silence after that, watching Lily's explorations, the comfortable quiet of two people who'd shared more than they'd intended and needed time to process. Sophie thought about loss and survival, about the different ways trauma carved itself into a person's foundation. Ethan had lost his wife and walked away from a career that had defined him. Sophie had lost herself to Marcus's control and fought her way back to something resembling autonomy, different paths, different pain. But maybe that's what recognized each other that day in the diner. Not romantic possibility or even friendship, but simple kinship between people who understood that rebuilding a life from rubble was harder than anyone who hadn't done it could imagine. "I should ask," Ethan said eventually, his voice careful, "about yesterday. About why those men were watching you. Grant mentioned you had trouble with an ex-boyfriend." Sophie's stomach dropped. "He told you that?" "He didn't give details, just said there might be more going on than a random attack, that you might need to be cautious." Ethan finally looked at her, his gray-blue eyes serious. "I'm not asking you to tell me your story, but if there's someone out there who means you harm, if Reynolds and Mitchell were hired rather than acting alone, that changes things. Changes how careful you need to be." The concern in his voice wasn't possessive or controlling. It was the straightforward worry of someone who'd seen too much violence not to take threats seriously. Sophie debated how much to reveal, then decided that if she was going to stay in Riverdale, if she was going to stop running, she needed allies who understood the stakes. "My ex-boyfriend's father owns a private investigation firm, the kind that does surveillance, tracks people, specializes in finding people who don't want to be found." The words came easier than expected, maybe because Ethan had shared his own scars first. "I left Marcus over a year ago, changed my name, moved 3 times, did everything right. But I think he hired his father's company to find me anyway, and I think Reynolds and Mitchell were part of that." Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the scar. "You think or you know?" "My lawyer called yesterday. She's building a case, trying to prove the connection. But yeah, in my gut, I know." Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild morning. "Marcus told me when I left that I'd never really get away, that he'd always find me, always know where I was. I thought he was just trying to scare me. Turns out he meant it. And the restraining order in Chicago? Denied. Insufficient evidence of physical threat." The old bitterness rose, acid in her throat. "His family has money, influence. My word against his wasn't enough." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge Sophie hadn't heard before, something cold and hard that reminded her he'd spent 12 years learning how to neutralize threats. "Does he know where you are now, specifically?" "I don't know. Reynolds and Mitchell did, obviously. But whether they reported back to Marcus before they were arrested, whether there are others watching, I don't know." The admission felt like defeat. "Then we assume yes. Assume he knows. Assume there are others. Assume the threat is ongoing." Ethan's tactical mind was clearly working through scenarios, assessing risk levels. "You're vulnerable in that apartment. One exit, exterior stairs, the bookstore owners are elderly and couldn't help if something happened." "I know." Sophie had spent half the night cataloging those same vulnerabilities. "But I can't afford to move and I'm tired of running. At some point, I have to stand my ground. Standing your ground is different from being reckless." His eyes met hers, intense and serious. "You need a safety plan. Someone who knows your schedule, who you check in with, security cameras, better locks, a way to get help if you need it." "I barely know anyone here. I've spent a year keeping people at arm's length, not making connections, staying invisible." The loneliness of that admission hit harder than expected. "That was the point. Be forgettable, unremarkable. Don't give anyone a reason to remember me." "That strategy hasn't worked." Ethan's voice was blunt but not unkind. "You can't stay invisible forever, and trying to fight this alone is how people get hurt." Lily came running back, breathless and beaming, her pockets full of feathers and interesting rocks, Daddy, we're going to be late for school. Ethan checked his watch, grimaced. She's right. We need to go. He stood, hesitated, then made a decision that showed in the set of his shoulders. Sophie, I know we just met. I know this is fast and probably crosses about 12 different boundaries. But if you need help, if you feel unsafe, if something happens, you call me. Anytime, day or night. He pulled out his phone, pulled up a new contact screen, and handed it to her. Sophie stared at it, at the implicit trust in the gesture, at the offering of protection without expectation of anything in return. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. His expression was firm, leaving no room for argument. I've got the training, the experience, and more importantly, I can't sleep knowing you're in that apartment alone with insufficient security while someone might be hunting you. So take the number, use it if you need it, and let me have some peace of mind. Call it selfish if it makes you feel better about accepting help. Sophie took the phone, typed in her contact information with shaking fingers, and handed it back. When it buzzed a moment later with a text, "This is Ethan. Save the number." She felt something loosen in her chest. Not attraction, not yet. Just the profound relief of not being alone anymore. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me. Just be careful." He ruffled Lily's hair, earning a squeal of protest. "Come on, Bug. School time." Sophie watched them go, Ethan's hand on his daughter's shoulder, Lily chattering about the feathers she'd collected. They looked like what they were, a father and daughter navigating life together, finding joy in small moments, building something stable from the wreckage of loss. And Sophie, standing in the autumn morning with a stuffed elephant under her arm and a phone number that felt like a lifeline, thought maybe she could build something too. Maybe Riverdale wasn't just another hiding place. Maybe it was where she finally stopped running and learned to fight back. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Legal aid forwarded attorney recommendations. Call Martin Chen first. He specializes in interstate stalking cases. Don't wait. Sophie looked at the message, at the park around her, at the quiet town that had somehow become a battlefield without anyone noticing. Then she pulled up Martin Chen's number and hit dial. If Marcus wanted a war, she'd give him one. But this time she wouldn't fight alone. Martin Chen answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone who billed by the hour and didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Sophie Moore? Jennifer Walsh sent over your preliminary file. I've got 20 minutes before my next call. Tell me everything, start to finish, and don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad. I've heard worse, and I need the whole picture to help you." Sophie found herself sitting on the park bench Ethan had vacated, the ducks still paddling in their lazy circles, and pouring out the stories she'd spent a year trying to bury. Marcus and the slow escalation from charming to controlling. The tracking apps he'd installed on her phone. The way he'd isolated her from friends, made her doubt her own perceptions, turned love into a cage she couldn't see until she was already trapped inside it. The threats when she finally left. The denied restraining order. The 3 towns she'd fled through before landing in Riverdale. Reynolds and Mitchell and the photographs on Mitchell's phone. Chen listened without interrupting, and Sophie could hear him typing, building a case file in real time from the scattered pieces of her nightmare. "Okay," he said when she finished. "Here's what we're dealing with. Illinois has strong anti-stalking laws, but they're hard to enforce across state lines. However, if we can prove Marcus hired advanced security solutions to track you, that's federal territory. Interstate stalking, conspiracy to violate protective orders, we can bring serious charges. The challenge is proving the connection between VSS, Reynolds, and Marcus. Reynolds is in custody. Won't he tell the police who hired him? Not if he's smart, and criminals are sometimes smarter than we'd like. He'll claim he and Mitchell were acting alone, saw a pretty woman, decided to follow her on their own initiative. Without proof of payment from VSS or communication with Marcus, it's just your suspicion against his denial." Chen's keyboard clicked steadily. "But here's the thing, private investigators have to keep records. Invoices, timesheets, surveillance logs. If VSS did hire Reynolds, there's a paper trail somewhere. We just need to find it. How do we do that? Subpoena their records. I'll file a civil suit against VSS for violation of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and about 6 other torts I can think of off the top of my head. Discovery process will force them to hand over their files. If Marcus's name appears anywhere, We've got him. Hope flickered in Sophie's chest, fragile as candlelight in a draft. How long will that take? Months if they fight it. And they will fight it. Leonard Vance didn't build his company by playing nice or respecting court orders, but eventually we'll get what we need. Chen paused, and his voice gentled slightly. In the meantime, you need to focus on immediate safety. Restraining order against Reynolds and Mitchell is good, but it's not enough. I want you to file for an emergency protective order against Marcus. Won't be easy to get without him being in the same state, but the pattern of behavior you've described, combined with the Reynolds incident, might be enough to convince a judge. And if it's not enough, then we document everything and try again. This is a marathon, Sophie, not a sprint. Abusive men with resources don't go away easily, but they also get sloppy when they're angry, when they feel like they're losing control. Marcus will make a mistake, and when he does, we'll be ready. Sophie thought about that, about Marcus's rage when things didn't go his way, about the mask slipping to reveal the cruelty underneath. Chen was right. Marcus would make a mistake. The question was whether Sophie would survive it. What do I do now? Today? Tomorrow? While we're building this case? Live your life, but carefully. Vary your routine so you're not predictable. Tell people you trust where you're going, when you'll be back. Install security cameras if your landlord allows it. And Sophie? Chen's voice went hard. If you see anyone watching you, if you feel like you're being followed, you call the police immediately. Don't wait. Don't second-guess yourself. Trust your instincts. They've kept you alive this long. After Chen hung up with promises to send paperwork and file the civil suit within the week, Sophie sat in the empty park and tried to process everything. A federal case, subpoenas, discovery, the legal machinery grinding slowly toward something that might resemble justice. But in the meantime, she was still alone in an apartment with one exit and a stalker who had the resources to find her anywhere. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Lily wanted me to make sure you're okay. Are you okay? The question was simple, but the concern behind it made Sophie's throat tight. She typed back, talk to a lawyer, building a case, scared but standing. The response came immediately. Good. Fear is smart. Paralysis is dangerous. You need anything? Sophie stared at those 3 words, you need anything, and felt the weight of genuine care behind them. Not the possessive care Marcus had wielded like a weapon, but the simple human decency of someone who saw another person in trouble and wanted to help. Just knowing I can call is enough. Thank you. Anytime. Mean it. Sophie pocketed her phone and headed back toward her apartment, Chen's advice echoing in her mind. Vary your routines. Tell people where you're going. Trust your instincts. The problem was her instincts had been screaming at her to run since Reynolds grabbed her wrist, and she was trying very hard to ignore them. The bookstore was open when she climbed the exterior stairs, and through the window she could see Carol shelving new arrivals while Jim manned the register. They waved when they saw her, their faces creased with the kind of lived-in kindness that came from 40 years of marriage and a shared love of books. Sophie waved back, trying not to think about how easily someone could get past 2 elderly people if they were determined enough. Inside her apartment, she locked the door, threw the deadbolt, and wedged the chair back under the handle. Then she pulled out her laptop and started researching security cameras, door reinforcement kits, and personal alarm systems. If she was staying, if she was fighting, she needed to turn this vulnerable apartment into something closer to a fortress. 3 hours later, she'd ordered cameras that would arrive in 2 days, watched 7 YouTube videos on how to reinforce door frames, and filled a shopping cart with pepper spray, a personal alarm, and a baseball bat that Amazon promised would arrive by tomorrow. It wasn't much, but it was something. Action against helplessness, preparation against panic. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Sophie's pulse spiked before she registered it was a local area code. Not Chicago, not Marcus. Hello? Sophie Moore? This is Dr. Sarah Brennan. I'm a therapist here in Riverdale, and Jennifer Walsh suggested I reach out. She thought you might benefit from some support as you navigate this situation with your ex. Sophie's first instinct was to decline. She didn't need therapy. She needed Marcus to leave her alone. But then she remembered the panic attacks that had plagued her first few months after leaving him. The nightmares that still jerked her awake some nights, the way her hands shook whenever a man raised his voice within earshot. I appreciate the call, Dr. Brennan, but I'm not sure I can afford. I work on a sliding scale, and Jennifer mentioned your financial constraints. We can figure something out that works for your budget. Brennan's voice was warm without being cloying, professional without being distant. Look, you don't have to commit to anything long term, but you're dealing with ongoing trauma while trying to build a legal case and maintain your normal life. That's a lot to carry alone. Sometimes it helps to have someone in your corner who's not emotionally invested, who can help you process without judgment. Sophie thought about the weight she'd been carrying, the hypervigilance, the constant fear, the way she analyzed every interaction for hidden threats, about how exhausting it was to live like that, how it drained the color from everything until even simple pleasures felt muted and gray. One session, she heard herself say. I'll try one session. That's all I'm asking. How's Thursday at 4? They made the appointment, and Sophie added it to her calendar with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Therapy meant talking about Marcus, about the relationship, about all the ways she'd let herself be diminished and controlled. It meant examining her own complicity in staying too long, her own blindness to red flags that seemed obvious in retrospect. But maybe that examination was necessary. Maybe she couldn't fully move forward while dragging the past behind her like chains. The week crept by with the particular slowness of waiting for danger that might never come. Sophie worked on her design projects, met with clients via video call, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But every footstep on the exterior stairs made her freeze. Every car that slowed near the bookstore sent her pulse racing. Every unknown number that called might be Marcus, might be another investigator, might be the beginning of the end. Thursday's therapy session was harder than expected. Dr. Brennan had kind eyes and an office that smelled like lavender, and she asked questions that sliced through Sophie's carefully constructed defenses like scalpels. Tell me about the first time you knew something was wrong with Marcus. Not in retrospect, the actual moment when you felt it in your gut. Sophie closed her eyes, reached back through the months and miles. 3 months in, we were at dinner with his colleagues. I mentioned wanting to take a photography class, just a casual comment. Marcus laughed and said I didn't have time for hobbies. I was too busy with work and him. Everyone laughed with him, like it was a joke, but his hand on my knee under the table was tight enough to bruise, and his eyes weren't laughing at all. What did you do? Nothing. I smiled and changed the subject and told myself I was overreacting, that he was just being playful, that I was too sensitive. The admission tasted like ashes. I never mentioned the photography class again. And that became the pattern? That became the pattern. He'd control something, I'd tell myself I was overreacting, he'd reward me for complying with affection and attention. Until the next thing. And the next. Until I looked up one day and realized I didn't recognize my own life anymore. Brennan nodded, writing notes in her leather-bound journal. The legal case you're building, how does it make you feel? Terrified, like I'm poking a sleeping dragon. Sophie twisted Mr. Trunk's ear between her fingers, the elephant a constant companion now. But also powerful, maybe? Like I'm finally fighting back instead of just surviving. Those can coexist. Terror and power, fear and courage. They're not opposites, they're partners. Brennan leaned forward slightly, her expression intent. Sophie, I want you to understand something. What Marcus did to you, what he's still doing, it's not your fault. Not the initial abuse, not your delay in leaving, not the fact that he's still pursuing you. None of it is your fault. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they made Sophie want to cry, to scream, to throw something at the wall and watch it shatter. Because if it wasn't her fault, if she really was just a victim of circumstances beyond her control, then what did that say about her agency, her power, her ability to protect herself going forward? I know that intellectually, she managed, but emotionally I keep thinking about all the times I could have left sooner, could have seen it coming, could have been smarter. Abuse rewires your brain. It makes you doubt your perceptions, second-guess your instincts. The fact that you eventually did leave, that you're fighting now, that's what matters. That's the proof of your strength. Saturday arrived with autumn sunshine and the kind of crisp air that made everything feel possible. Sophie dressed carefully for the dance recital. Nice jeans, a soft sweater, minimal makeup. Not trying too hard, but not dismissing the occasion either. She'd spent too much of her life making herself small and invisible. Maybe it was time to take up a little space. The community center was exactly as chaotic as Ethan had warned. Parents jockeyed for seats, younger siblings ran wild in the aisles, and the air buzzed with the particular energy of dozens of 6-year-olds hopped up on excitement, and probably too much sugar. Sophie found a seat 3 rows back, close enough to see, but not so close she'd be in family photos, and tried to ignore the stares from people who recognized her as the woman from the diner incident. Small towns had long memories and active gossip networks. Sophie had learned that much. "Miss Sophie!" Lily's voice cut through the chaos. She appeared in full costume, pink tutu, sparkly leotard, hair in an elaborate bun that must have taken Ethan an hour, and launched herself at Sophie with the confidence of someone who'd never been rejected. "You came. You really came. Daddy said you would, but I was worried maybe you'd forget or get scared of all the people, but you're here." "I made a promise." Sophie hugged the little girl carefully, aware of the elaborate costume. "You look beautiful, Lily. Very professional. Mrs. Patterson says we have to be serious and focused because dance is art, and art is important." Lily's face was grave, clearly repeating a lecture she'd heard multiple times. "But between you and me, it's also really fun." "Lily," Ethan appeared, slightly out of breath, clearly having chased his daughter through the crowded center. He wore dark jeans and a button-down shirt that looked new, his hair still damp from a recent shower. And Sophie felt something shift in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine. "You're supposed to be backstage. Mrs. Patterson is going to have a heart attack if she has to wrangle the whole class alone." "I just wanted to say hi to Miss Sophie." "You said hi. Now go before Mrs. Patterson sends a search party." But his voice was fond, indulgent in the way of fathers who knew they were wrapped around their daughter's fingers. Lily squeezed Sophie once more and scampered off, tutu bouncing. Ethan watched her go, then turned to Sophie with an expression that was equal parts apology and amusement. "Thank you for coming. You didn't have to. I wanted to." Sophie gestured to the empty seat beside her. "There's room, if you want, unless you're sitting with other parents." "I usually sit alone." He hesitated, clearly weighing social norms against desire. "But if you're offering, I'm offering." He sat, and Sophie was immediately aware of his presence in a way that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with safety. The solid warmth of him, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential threats even in this benign environment. The way he angled himself slightly toward her, creating a subtle barrier between Sophie and the rest of the room. Protection without possessiveness, care without control. The difference was stark, undeniable. "How was your week?" His voice was low, meant only for her under the ambient noise. "Any trouble?" "Quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." Sophie adjusted Mr. Trunk on her lap. She'd brought him for moral support, and because it felt wrong to attend Lily's recital without him. "Met with a therapist, starting to build the legal case. Turned my apartment into something resembling Fort Knox." "Good. All of that is good." He paused. "The therapist especially. This kind of stress, it gets into your bones if you don't process it." "Speaking from experience?" "Speaking from experience." His jaw tightened, old pain flickering across his features. "After Hannah died, I thought I could just push through it. Be strong for Lily, keep moving forward. Took me 2 years and a concerned letter from Lily's kindergarten teacher to admit I needed help." The admission surprised her, not because she doubted he'd struggled, but because men like Ethan, men with his training and background, usually wore their stoicism like armor. The fact that he'd admitted to needing help, to being vulnerable, felt like another gift. Did it help, the therapy? Eventually. Not right away, and not easily. But yeah, it helped. Helped me understand that grief doesn't have a timeline, that being strong for Lily didn't mean pretending I was fine when I wasn't. He glanced at her, his eyes serious. "It'll help you too, if you let it. Just don't expect miracles overnight." The lights dimmed before Sophie could respond, and Mrs. Patterson, a tiny woman with an enormous presence, took the stage to welcome everyone to the annual fall recital. The next 90 minutes were a blur of tiny dancers in various states of coordination, proud parents filming everything on phones held at awkward angles, and occasional chaos when someone forgot their routine or got stage fright. But when Lily's group performed, Sophie found herself leaning forward, breath caught in her throat. The little girl moved with surprising grace for someone 6 3/4, her face a mask of concentration that occasionally broke into a grin when she nailed a particularly difficult step. And when the music ended and the audience applauded, Lily's eyes found Sophie immediately, her whole face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made Sophie's chest ache. "She's incredible," Sophie said, meaning it. "You must be so proud." "Every single day. Ethan's voice was rough with emotion, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "She's everything good about Hannah and nothing bad about me. I don't know how I got that lucky." The comment was meant to be self-deprecating, but Sophie heard the real fear underneath, the terror of failing his daughter, of his own darkness somehow tainting her light. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Lily's kindness and bravery came from him as much as her late mother. But the words felt too intimate, too revealing of how much she'd come to care about these two people in such a short time. After the recital ended and the chaos of parents retrieving excited children from backstage reached its peak, Lily emerged still in her costume, clutching a small bouquet someone had given her. Did you see? Did you see my grand jeté? I didn't fall and Emma did fall, but just a little bit, and Mrs. Patterson said we were all beautiful." "You were perfect." Sophie accepted the hug Lily threw at her, the little girl's enthusiasm warming something cold and scared in her chest. "Best grand jeté I've ever seen." "Have you seen a lot of grand jetés?" "No, but I've seen enough to know yours was special." This logic satisfied Lily, who turned to her father with the same boundless energy. "Can Miss Sophie come to dinner? Please. We're going to Giovanni's and they have really good breadsticks, and I want to tell her about the time Emma and I—" "Lily." Ethan's voice carried a warning note. Miss Sophie might have other plans. Sophie should say yes, she had other plans. Should maintain the boundaries that were already blurring dangerously. Should go home to her fortress apartment and continue building her case and not get any more entangled with this family that made her want things she'd stopped believing were possible. "I don't have other plans," she heard herself say. "And I do love breadsticks." Giovanni's was a small Italian restaurant on the edge of town, the kind of place with red checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles, and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. The owner, an elderly man who introduced himself as Giovanni himself, greeted Ethan and Lily with the warmth of old friends. "Ethan, little Lily, and who is this beautiful lady?" His eyes twinkled as he looked at Sophie, clearly assuming she was Ethan's girlfriend. "This is Sophie, a friend," Ethan said quickly, too quickly. "She came to Lily's recital." "Ah, a friend. Of course, of course." But Giovanni's knowing smile suggested he thought otherwise as he led them to a corner booth. "I'll bring the breadsticks, extra butter for Miss Lily." They ordered pasta for Lily, chicken parmesan for Ethan, and eggplant parmesan for Sophie, and fell into the easy rhythm of shared meal conversation. Lily dominated the discussion, recounting every detail of the recital with the thoroughness of someone providing testimony, while Ethan and Sophie exchanged amused glances over her head. It felt normal, dangerously, seductively normal. Like they were a family, like this was a regular Saturday tradition, like Sophie belonged in this booth with these people. "Miss Sophie," Lily said around a mouthful of pasta that made her father grimace, "do you have a family, like a mom and dad and brothers and sisters?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples in every direction. Sophie set down her fork, choosing her words carefully. "I have a mom and a younger brother. They live in California." "Do you see them a lot?" "Not as much as I'd like." The truth was she hadn't seen them in over a year, hadn't even told them she'd left Marcus. Her mother had loved Marcus, had thought Sophie was being difficult when she'd tried to explain her concerns. Her brother had been consumed with his own life, his new job and new girlfriend. Neither had been equipped to understand what was happening, and Sophie had been too exhausted to explain. "That's sad." Lily's face crumpled with genuine distress. "Families should be together. Daddy says family is the most important thing." "Lilybug, not everyone's family situation is the same." Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. Sometimes families are complicated. Sometimes people have good reasons for keeping distance. But that's sad, Lily insisted, her 6-year-old logic unable to accept ambiguity. Miss Sophie should have family close by so she's not lonely. I have Mr. Trunk, Sophie said, injecting levity she didn't feel. And friends. I'm not lonely. It was a lie, and from Ethan's expression, he knew it. But he didn't call her on it, just redirected Lily to a story about one of her classmates and let Sophie collect herself in the privacy of her own thoughts. They were finishing dessert, tiramisu for the adults, chocolate gelato for Lily, when Sophie's phone buzzed. She glanced at it automatically, then felt the blood drain from her face. Unknown number, Chicago area code. A text message that made the restaurant spin around her. Found you. Did you really think you could hide forever? We should talk, Sophie, face to face. I miss you. Her hand started shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone. Ethan noticed immediately, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert in a heartbeat. What is it? Sophie couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She just turned the phone so he could read the message, watched his expression go cold and hard. Block the number, now. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was steel underneath. Then forward it to your lawyer and to Sheriff Grant. This is evidence. He found me. He knows. Sophie's voice cracked, panic rising in her throat like bile. I thought I had time. I thought, Sophie, look at me. Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Not grabbing, not controlling, just anchoring. Breathe. You're safe right now, in this moment. Whatever happens next, we handle it. But right now, you're safe. Lily watched with wide eyes, clearly picking up on the tension but not understanding it. Daddy? What's wrong? Is Miss Sophie sick? She's okay, Bug. Just got some bad news. He squeezed Sophie's hand once, then released it. Sophie, do you want to go home? Or would you rather not be alone right now? The question was simple, the answer complex. Home meant isolation, vulnerability. But staying meant imposing on Ethan and Lily, dragging them deeper into her mess. Except they were already in it, weren't they? The moment Ethan had stood up in the diner, the moment Lily had offered Mr. Trunk, the moment Sophie had accepted these small kindnesses, they'd all become entangled in each other's lives. I don't want to be alone, Sophie whispered, but I don't want to put you in danger either. Let me worry about danger. Ethan's expression was grim, determined. You're coming home with us tonight. Tomorrow we figure out next steps. But tonight, you're not alone in that apartment waiting for Marcus to show up. Ethan, not negotiable. His tone brooked no argument, and Sophie was too shaken to try. Pay the bill, Giovanni. We're leaving. The drive to Ethan's house passed in a blur. Sophie sat in the back seat with Lily, who'd fallen asleep almost immediately, her small body warm and trusting against Sophie's side. Ethan drove in silence, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, taking turns that doubled back on themselves. Tactical driving, making sure they weren't followed. His house was a modest ranch on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees that would be beautiful in daylight and felt protective in the darkness. Inside was clean but lived in, with Lily's drawings covering the refrigerator and toys organized in bins along one wall. A life built with care and intention, every detail speaking to a father doing his best. Guest rooms down the hall, second door on the left, clean sheets, towels in the closet. Ethan carried his sleeping daughter toward her bedroom, then paused. I'm going to put Lily down, then we need to call Grant and your lawyer. That text isn't just threatening, it's stupid. Marcus just handed you evidence. Sophie nodded numbly, watching him disappear into Lily's room. She could hear his low voice through the door, the gentle sounds of bedtime routines. When he emerged 10 minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral. Coffee? Something stronger? Coffee, please. I need to think clearly. They sat at his kitchen table while the coffee brewed, and Ethan called Sheriff Grant, putting the phone on speaker so Sophie could contribute. Grant's response was immediate and professional. He'd coordinate with Chicago PD, document the text as harassment, add it to the growing case file. This is good for your case, Miss Moore. Shows pattern of behavior, shows he's actively pursuing you across state lines. But it also means he's escalating, getting bolder. You need to be careful. After Grant hung up, Ethan called Martin Chen, who answered despite the late hour and listened to the situation with the focused intensity of a man who'd heard similar stories too many times. "This changes things," Chen said. "This is direct contact, explicit threat. Combined with Reynolds and Mitchell, we can push for that emergency protective order immediately. I'll file first thing Monday morning. In the meantime, Sophie, do not respond to that text. Do not engage. Any communication gives him what he wants." "What does he want?" Sophie's voice was barely audible. "Control, power, to know he can still get to you. Don't give him the satisfaction." After the calls ended, Sophie and Ethan sat in silence, coffee growing cold between them. Outside, the wind picked up, branches scraping against windows, normal sounds that suddenly felt sinister. "You should sleep," Ethan said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be long." "I don't think I can." Sophie wrapped her hands around her mug, seeking warmth. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that message. We should talk, face to face, like he has any right to demand my time, my attention, like I owe him anything after—" "You don't owe him anything." Ethan's voice was firm, cutting through her spiral. "And you're not going to talk to him, face to face or otherwise. That's not happening. You can't protect me forever. This isn't your fight. Maybe not." His eyes met hers across the table, gray-blue and determined. "But it is for tonight, so let me do this. Let me make sure you're safe for one night, and tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." Sophie wanted to argue, to insist she could handle it alone. But the truth was, she was terrified and exhausted and so tired of being strong all by herself. So she just nodded and let Ethan show her to the guest room with its clean sheets and soft pillows and door that locked from the inside. "I'm right down the hall," he said from the doorway. "Light sleeper. If you need anything, don't hesitate." After he left, Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, Mr. Trunk clutched to her chest and let herself shake. Marcus had found her. Despite everything, despite all her precautions, he'd found her. And now she had to decide, run again or stay and fight with allies she barely knew but was starting to trust more than she'd trusted anyone in years. Through the walls, she could hear Ethan moving around his house, checking locks, closing blinds, protecting his home, his daughter, and now her too. It should have felt suffocating, like Marcus's control. Instead, it felt like the first real safety she'd known in years. Sophie pulled out her phone, stared at Marcus's message one more time, then blocked the number. It was a small act of defiance, but it was something. A line drawn, a boundary established. Tomorrow she'd figure out next steps. Tomorrow she'd face whatever came with the help of lawyers and sheriffs and a man who'd learned to fight in war zones and chose to use that knowledge protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Chicago, Sophie let herself sleep deeply. Because tonight, she wasn't alone. And that made all the difference in the world. Sophie woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and the distant sound of a child's laughter. For one disoriented moment, she couldn't place where she was. Then the previous night came rushing back. Marcus's text, the panic at Giovanni's, Ethan's steady presence in the guest room that had become a sanctuary. She checked her phone. 7:30 on a Sunday morning, 3 new texts from blocked numbers she didn't recognize, all variations on the same theme, Marcus trying different approaches, different phone numbers, casting his net wider when she'd blocked the first attempt. "I know you're reading these, Sophie. You can't ignore me forever. We need to talk about your behavior. This is childish." The last one made her laugh, a bitter sound in the quiet room. Her behavior was childish. Not his stalking, not his refusal to accept her autonomy, not his campaign of harassment that had driven her across 3 states. No, her crime was refusing to engage, refusing to play the game he'd scripted where she was always wrong and he was always the wounded party trying to save her from herself. Sophie blocked all 3 numbers, screenshot the messages for Chen and Grant, and forced herself out of bed. The house was quiet except for those distant sounds of mourning. Lily's voice raised in some elaborate game, Ethan's lower murmur in response. Normal family sounds that made Sophie's chest ache with longing for something she'd never really had. She found them in the kitchen, Lily still in her pajamas and perched on the counter while Ethan made pancakes. The scene was so domestic, so perfectly ordinary, that Sophie almost backed out of the room. This wasn't her life. These weren't her people. She was an intruder, a complication they didn't need. But Lily spotted her before she could retreat. "Miss Sophie, you're awake. Daddy's making chocolate chip pancakes because it's Sunday and Sundays are special. Do you want chocolate chips in yours or blueberries? We have both." Chocolate chips sound perfect. Sophie stepped into the kitchen, hyper aware of her rumpled clothes and the fact that she'd slept in her makeup. "Thank you for letting me stay. I hope I didn't disrupt your routine too much." "You didn't." Ethan poured batter onto the griddle, his movements economical and practiced. "Coffee's fresh, mugs are in the cabinet above the pot. How'd you sleep?" "Better than expected, actually." It was true. Once she'd finally fallen asleep, she'd slept deeply, dreamlessly. The kind of sleep her body desperately needed but rarely allowed itself. Though Marcus tried reaching out again. 3 more numbers this morning. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Forward them to Grant and your lawyer. Every contact is evidence. Every attempt builds your case." "I know, I did." Sophie poured coffee, adding cream from the refrigerator that was covered in Lily's artwork. "It's just exhausting, you know? The persistence of it. Like he can't conceive of a world where I'm actually done, where no means no. Because in his world, no never means no. It means not yet, or try harder, or wear her down." Ethan flipped pancakes with the precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Men like that, they don't see women as people with autonomy. They see possessions that temporarily malfunction. And when a possession breaks free, they can't compute it. The analysis was clinical, accurate, and spoke to a depth of understanding that made Sophie curious. "You sound like you've dealt with men like Marcus before." "In the Navy, yeah. Different context, but same pathology. Men who thought rank or strength gave them ownership over others, who couldn't understand why their targets didn't appreciate being controlled." His expression darkened with old anger. "I've seen what they're capable of when they don't get their way. It's not pretty." Lily, oblivious to the undercurrent of the conversation, kicked her feet against the cabinet. "Daddy, can we go to the park after breakfast? I want to show Miss Sophie the big slide. It's really big and kind of scary, but also really fun." "We'll see, Bug. Depends on what Miss Sophie wants to do." Ethan plated pancakes, setting them in front of Lily and Sophie with the kind of care most people reserve for fine china. She might need to get back to her apartment, check on things. Sophie thought about her apartment, the fortress she'd tried to build, the isolation she'd cultivated. The idea of going back there alone, knowing Marcus was actively hunting her, made her stomach turn. "Actually, if the offer still stands, I'd like to stay another day, just until we hear back from the lawyer about the protective order. I don't want to impose, but..." "You're not imposing." Ethan's response was immediate, firm. "Stay as long as you need. We've got the space, and honestly, I'd rather know you're here than wondering if you're safe in that apartment. But your life, your routine, can handle one extra person." He settled into the chair across from her, his own plate forgotten. "Look, I know this is uncomfortable. I know you don't like needing help, that accepting it feels like weakness. But Marcus is escalating, and that means the next few days are critical. Let us help. Let me help. Please." The please undid her. Sophie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and focused on her pancakes to hide the tears threatening to spill over. Lily chattered through breakfast about the park and her friend Emma, and whether purple or blue was the better color for absolutely everything, filling the silence with the easy joy of someone who'd never learned that the world could be cruel. After breakfast, Ethan insisted Sophie borrow some of his clothes, a flannel shirt and sweatpants that swallowed her frame but felt safer than a rumpled outfit from the day before. Then they walked to the park, the 3 of them, Lily skipping ahead while Ethan maintained his constant vigilance, his eyes scanning every car, every person, every potential threat. The park was busier on Sunday morning, filled with families enjoying the autumn sunshine. Sophie watched them, the parents pushing strollers, the kids climbing on playground equipment, the dogs chasing balls in the open field. All these people living normal lives, unaware that predators walked among them, that safety was an illusion maintained only by constant vigilance and luck. "You're doing it again." Ethan's voice was quiet, meant only for her. "Doing what?" "Cataloging threats. looking for danger in every shadow. He nodded toward Lily, who was climbing the big slide with determination. I do it too. Can't help it after years of training, but sometimes you have to let yourself just be present, just exist without waiting for the ambush. How? The question came out raw, desperate. How do you do that when you know what people are capable of? Practice. Therapy. Reminding yourself that the world isn't entirely made of threats. He was quiet for a moment, watching his daughter reach the top of the slide and wave triumphantly. And finding people worth being present for, people who make you want to stop scanning for exits and start actually living. Sophie looked at him, really looked, at the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, at the way his whole being oriented toward Lily, protective and proud, at the careful space he maintained between himself and Sophie, never crowding, never assuming, always asking. Is that what Lily did for you after your wife? Yeah, Lily gave me a reason to keep going when everything else felt pointless. She needed me, so I figured out how to be what she needed, even when I had no idea what I was doing. He smiled slightly, the expression bittersweet. Still figuring it out, honestly, but she's patient with my mistakes. She's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one. He said it with such conviction that Sophie felt something shift in her chest. The recognition that maybe she was lucky too, to have found these people in this small town when she needed them most. They spent 2 hours at the park, Lily demanding they push her on the swings and watch her master the monkey bars and judge her technique on the slide. It was exhausting in the best way, pulling Sophie out of her head and into the immediate present where a 6-year-old's laughter was the most important sound in the world. But reality intruded when Ethan's phone rang and Sheriff Grant's name flashed on the screen. Grant, what have you got? Ethan stepped away from the playground, but Sophie could hear the tension in his voice. She couldn't hear Grant's response, but she watched Ethan's expression harden, watched his free hand curl into a fist at his side. When he hung up, he stood very still for a long moment before walking back to where Sophie waited. That was Grant. Chicago PD ran the numbers Marcus used to text you. All burner phones purchased with cash at different stores across the city. Untraceable. Of course they are. Sophie's stomach sank. He's too smart to use his real phone. Gets worse. Reynolds made bail this morning. Judge set it high, but someone paid it in cash. Reynolds walked out of lockup 2 hours ago. Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but Sophie could see the anger simmering underneath. Grant thinks it was Vance Security Solutions pulling strings, getting their asset back on the street. Reynolds is coming here. It wasn't a question. Sophie felt the certainty of it in her bones, the inevitable conclusion of Marcus's escalation. He's coming to finish what he started. We don't know that. Yes, we do. Sophie's hands were shaking again, adrenaline flooding her system. Marcus sent those texts to let me know he found me. Then someone bails out Reynolds. This is coordinated, planned. They're tightening the noose. Ethan looked at Lily, still playing happily on the swings, oblivious to the danger circling closer. Then he looked at Sophie, and she saw the decision crystallize in his eyes. The soldier assessing a tactical situation and choosing his course of action. Okay, here's what's going to happen. We're going back to my house, we're locking down tight, and you're not going anywhere alone until Reynolds is back in custody or this situation is resolved. I'm calling Grant back, telling him to put a patrol car on my street. And tomorrow, first thing, we're meeting with your lawyer and figuring out how to accelerate this protective order. Ethan, I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm telling you how this is going to go. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. Marcus wants to scare you into running or engaging. We're not doing either. We're standing our ground, building the case, and keeping you safe while the legal system catches up. That's the plan. Sophie wanted to argue, to insist she could handle it herself, but the truth was she was terrified, and the idea of facing this alone made her want to curl into a ball and never emerge. So she just nodded, hating her weakness, but grateful for his strength. They collected Lily and headed home, Ethan taking a deliberately circuitous route that doubled back on itself multiple times. Sophie recognized the tactics from movies, from thrillers where heroes evaded pursuit. It felt surreal, like she'd stepped into a narrative that couldn't possibly be her real life. But it was her life. This was happening. Marcus had found her, Reynolds was free, and the carefully constructed safety of Riverdale was crumbling around her. Back at the house, Ethan made good on his promises. He called Grant, who promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood and personally check in twice a day. He called Martin Chen, who was already drafting the emergency protective order and promised to file it first thing Monday morning. He checked every window lock, every door, activated a security system Sophie hadn't noticed before. Military habit, he explained when he caught her watching. Even before Hannah died, I kept the house secure. After it became non-negotiable. Lily's safety is everything. And now mine is part of that equation. Sophie sat on his couch, Mr. Trunk in her lap, watching him move through security protocols with practiced efficiency. That's a lot of responsibility you're taking on for someone you barely know. I know you well enough. Ethan settled into the armchair across from her, his expression serious. I know you're brave enough to leave an abusive relationship even when the system failed you. I know you're strong enough to keep fighting when running would be easier. I know you make my daughter laugh and you treat her kindness like the gift it is. That's enough. What if this goes bad? What if Marcus shows up here, or Reynolds, or whoever else Vance Security sends? What if... Then I handle it. Simple words, but backed by 12 years of training and a protective instinct that ran bone deep. Sophie, I've faced threats worse than Marcus Vance and his hired thugs. I've operated in war zones where danger came from every direction. This is just another mission, and I don't fail missions when someone I care about is on the line. Someone I care about. The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to fully examine. Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks, felt something warm and dangerous unfurl in her chest. I care about you too, she heard herself say. You and Lily both. Which is exactly why I should leave before I drag you deeper into this mess. Too late. We're already in it. His smile was slight, almost sad. And I've learned that the people worth protecting are exactly the ones worth the risk. They spent the afternoon in careful domesticity, Ethan working on his laptop while Sophie sketched designs, Lily building elaborate structures with blocks and demanding periodic admiration from the adults. It should have been peaceful. Instead, every car that drove past made Sophie tense. Every unexpected sound sent her pulse racing. Around 4, Lily fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from her park adventures. Ethan covered her with a blanket, his touch achingly gentle, then joined Sophie in the kitchen where she was making tea just to have something to do with her hands. You're going to wear a hole in that mug if you keep gripping it that hard. His voice was gentle, without judgment. I can't stop thinking about what happens next. Best case scenario, the protective order goes through and Marcus backs off. But what if he doesn't? What if he escalates further? What if... Sophie. Ethan moved closer, not touching, but present, solid. You can what if yourself into paralysis. I've done it. Spent whole nights running scenarios and contingencies until I couldn't see straight. But here's what I learned. You can only control what's in front of you. Right now, in this moment, you're safe. That's what matters. How do you do that? How do you stay so calm when everything's falling apart? Practice and perspective. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. In Afghanistan, we had a saying, control what you can control, accept what you can't, and know the difference. You can control your actions, your choices, how you respond to threats. You can't control Marcus or the legal system or whether Reynolds shows up tomorrow. So focus on what's in your power and let the rest go. That sounds very zen for someone who spent 12 years shooting people. Shooting people taught me a lot about zen, actually. The comment was wry, self-aware. When your job is controlled violence in chaotic environments, you learn to find stillness in the storm, or you break. I've seen guys break. Decided early on that wasn't going to be me. Sophie studied him, this man who'd built a life from the wreckage of loss and violence, who protected his daughter with the same fierce competence he'd once used to protect his country, who was offering that same protection to Sophie without asking for anything in return. Why are you doing this? Really? And don't say it's just the right thing to do, because plenty of people know the right thing and choose not to do it. Ethan was quiet for a long time, his eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. Because I know what it's like to be powerless, to watch someone you love slip away and not be able to stop it. Hannah died before I could even say goodbye, before I could tell her all the things I should have said when I had the chance. He paused, swallowing hard. I can't change that. Can't bring her back or get those moments. But I can make sure other people don't feel that same powerlessness. I can use what I learned, what I became, to protect people who need it. So that's what I do. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but Sophie didn't have better ones. I'm sorry you lost her. I'm sorry you had to rebuild your whole life. And I'm sorry I'm bringing danger to your door. Don't be sorry for that. Be sorry if you try to face it alone when you don't have to. He finally met her eyes, and Sophie saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. You don't have to do this alone, Sophie. Not anymore. The moment stretched, fragile and loaded, until Lily's sleepy voice broke it. Daddy, I'm hungry. Ethan's smile was immediate, automatic. Of course you are. Let's see what we can make for dinner. They made spaghetti together, the three of them moving around the kitchen with surprising coordination. Lily insisted on helping, which meant noodles everywhere and sauce on her shirt, but her joy was infectious enough that even Sophie found herself laughing. For a few hours, the threat of Marcus and Reynolds faded into background noise, overshadowed by the simple pleasure of good food and better company. After dinner, Lily wanted to watch a movie, so they settled on the couch, Lily between Sophie and Ethan, her small body warm and trusting. Halfway through, she fell asleep again, her head on Sophie's lap, her hand clutching Mr. Trunk. She's never this comfortable with strangers, Ethan said quietly, watching his daughter sleep. Usually takes her months to warm up to new people. But with you, it was instant. Like she recognized something. What do you think she recognized? Someone who needed her as much as she needed them. He said it simply, without artifice. Lily's got good instincts about people. Better than mine, sometimes. They sat in the flickering light of the television, neither watching the movie, both lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Ethan carried Lily to bed, and Sophie helped clean up the kitchen, grateful for the mundane task. It was almost 9 when Sophie's phone rang. Unknown number, but a Riverdale area code this time. She answered on speaker so Ethan could hear. Sophie Moore? A woman's voice, professional but urgent. Speaking. This is Carol from Riverdale Books. I'm sorry to call so late, but there's been an incident at your apartment. Someone broke in through your door. The police are here now, but they wanted me to let you know. Sophie felt the floor tilt. What? When? About an hour ago. Jim and I were closing the shop when we heard crashing upstairs. By the time we got the police here, whoever it was had already gone. But Sophie, they destroyed everything. Your apartment is trashed. Ethan was already moving, grabbing his keys, his phone. We're coming. Don't touch anything, Carol. This is a crime scene. The drive to her apartment felt like it took hours instead of 15 minutes. Sophie's mind raced through possibilities. Was it Marcus, Reynolds, some random thief? Did it matter who when the result was the same violation of her space, her safety, her carefully constructed sanctuary? Sheriff Grant met them at the exterior stairs, his expression grim. Miss Moore. Glad you weren't home when this happened. The apartment was worse than Sophie had imagined. Furniture overturned, clothes scattered, her laptop smashed, work files torn to shreds. Every drawer dumped, every cabinet emptied, destruction for destruction's sake. And on her bathroom mirror, written in what looked like lipstick, a message that made her blood run cold. You can't hide from me. We will talk. Soon. Sophie stood in the doorway, unable to make herself enter, while Ethan moved through the space with Grant, cataloging damage, taking photos, examining the forced door for evidence. Professional job, Grant said, pointing to the lock. Quick, efficient, knew exactly how to defeat your deadbolt. And the message suggests this wasn't random theft. It was Marcus. Sophie's voice sounded distant to her own ears. Or someone working for him, sending a message. Well, he sent it loud and clear. Grant's expression was thunderous. And he just handed us more evidence for your case. Breaking and entering, destruction of property, criminal threatening. Chen's going to have a field day with this. Ethan appeared at Sophie's side, his jaw tight with controlled anger. She can't stay here. Even after we repair the door, it's not safe. Agreed. Grant looked between them, clearly drawing conclusions. You got somewhere else she can go? Friend? Family? She's staying with me. Ethan's voice brooked no argument. For as long as necessary. Grant nodded slowly. All right then. I'll have a deputy stay here tonight, document everything, collect evidence. Sophie, you'll need to make a list of anything valuable that's missing or destroyed for insurance purposes, but that can wait until tomorrow. They left with only what Sophie had brought to Ethan's house the night before. Her phone, her purse, Mr. Trunk. Everything else was contaminated, violated by Marcus's proxies and their message of ownership and control. In Ethan's truck, Sophie finally let herself shake, the adrenaline crash hitting hard. Ethan drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching across to cover hers, not restraining, just anchoring her to the present moment. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? For bringing this to your door, for putting Lily at risk, for... Stop. His voice was firm but gentle. This isn't your fault. Marcus did this, not you. And Lily's not at risk because you're here. She's safer because I'm paying attention, because I know there's a threat out there. You being here actually makes us all safer. How do you figure that? Because now I'm not alone in protecting her. Now I've got someone who understands the stakes, who'll watch her back when I can't. He pulled into his driveway, killed the engine. You're not a burden, Sophie. You're an ally. Remember that. Inside, the house was quiet, Lily still asleep. Ethan made chamomile tea that Sophie couldn't taste, and they sat at the kitchen table in the comfortable silence of two people too exhausted for words. Finally, Ethan spoke. Tomorrow, we go to war. We file the protective order, we press charges for the break-in, we make Marcus's life so legally complicated he'll wish he'd never heard your name. But tonight, you rest. You're safe here, and nothing's getting through that door without going through me first. Sophie looked at this man who'd become her unexpected protector, who offered safety without possession, strength without control, who understood that protecting someone meant giving them power, not taking it away. Thank you, she said, meaning it more deeply than the words could convey. For everything. Thank me when this is over, and you're free. He stood, stretched, the exhaustion showing in every line of his body. Get some sleep, Sophie. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But sleep didn't come easily. Sophie lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Marcus's message on her mirror. About Reynolds out on bail and the systematic destruction of her apartment. About the fact that she'd dragged a good man and his innocent daughter into a war they hadn't asked for. And about the fact that for the first time since leaving Chicago, she wasn't planning her next escape route. She was planning to stand and fight. Because Riverdale wasn't just another hiding place anymore. It was home. And she'd be damned if she let Marcus take that from her too. Sophie must have fallen asleep eventually because she woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee, her body stiff from tension she'd carried even in sleep. Monday morning had arrived whether she was ready or not, bringing with it the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed any longer. She found Ethan already up, dressed in clean jeans and a dark Henley, his phone pressed to his ear while he paced the kitchen. Lily sat at the table with a coloring book, humming softly to herself, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. Understood. We'll be there at 9. Ethan hung up, his expression unreadable. That was Chen. He filed the emergency protective order first thing this morning, expedited hearing scheduled for this afternoon. Judge Warner's presiding. Grant says she's tough but fair, doesn't tolerate stalkers or abusers. This afternoon? Sophie's stomach clenched. That's fast. Chen pushed hard, used the break-in as evidence of escalating danger. Warner agreed to hear it today instead of making you wait. He poured coffee, set it in front of her with the automatic care that had become familiar over the past 2 days. You'll need to testify, tell your story, show the judge the pattern of Marcus's behavior. Can you do that? Sophie thought about standing in a courtroom, recounting every moment of manipulation and control, every threat and violation. Thought about Marcus potentially being there, watching her with those cold eyes that had once looked at her with something she'd mistaken for love. I can do it. Her voice was steadier than she felt. I have to. Good. Grant's meeting us at the courthouse with all the evidence, the texts, the surveillance photos Mitchell had, documentation of the break-in. Chen's been building this case since you first contacted him, and he's ready. Ethan sat across from her, his expression serious. But Sophie, you need to prepare yourself. Marcus might be there. His lawyers definitely will be. They're going to try to make you look unstable, dramatic, vindictive. They're going to twist everything you say. I know. She'd read enough about protective order hearings to understand the playbook. They'll say I'm lying, that Marcus is the real victim, that I'm just an ex-girlfriend who can't let go. That's what his family's lawyers did in Chicago. Except this time you've got evidence they can't explain away. You've got Reynolds and Mitchell's arrest, the photographs, the burner phone texts, the destroyed apartment. His jaw tightened. And you've got me, willing to testify about what I saw at the diner, about the threat assessment I've done as someone with tactical training. They can dismiss you as emotional, but they can't dismiss the facts. Lily looked up from her coloring, her young face scrunched with concern. Why are you and Daddy talking about bad stuff? Is someone being mean to you, Miss Sophie? Sophie's heart clenched at the question, at the simple way Lily framed complex violence. Someone being mean, if only it were that simple. Yes, sweetheart, someone from my old life is being mean, and we're trying to make them stop. She chose her words carefully, unwilling to lie, but equally unwilling to burden this child with adult horrors. Your daddy's helping me, and the police are helping too, so I'm going to be okay. Good. Lily returned to her coloring with the easy acceptance of someone who'd never doubted that adults could fix problems. Daddy's really good at making mean people stop. One time at school, this big kid was pushing kids down, and Daddy talked to him, and the kid said sorry and never did it again. That's different, Bug. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. This is grown-up stuff, more complicated. But you'll still fix it, right? Because that's what you do. You fix things and keep people safe. The absolute faith in Lily's voice made Sophie want to cry. I'll do everything I can. Ethan met Sophie's eyes across the table, and she saw the promise there. Not a guarantee of victory, but a commitment to fight until there was nothing left to fight with. They dropped Lily at school with careful instructions to the principal about who was and wasn't authorized for pickup, then drove to the courthouse in silence. Sophie watched Riverdale pass by the truck windows, the familiar storefronts, the people going about their Monday routines, the small-town normalcy that felt increasingly distant from her reality. Martin Chen met them on the courthouse steps, a compact man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an air of controlled intensity. He shook Sophie's hand firmly, nodded to Ethan with professional assessment, then launched into rapid-fire preparation. The hearing's at 2. Judge Warner will hear testimony from you, review the evidence, and make her ruling. Marcus's lawyers filed a response this morning claiming the protective order is unnecessary, that you're harassing him, that the Chicago denial proves your claims are baseless. Chen's expression was grim. They're good, expensive, and they're going to fight dirty. But we've got something they don't, the truth and evidence to back it up. Is Marcus here? Sophie forced herself to ask. Not yet. His lawyers are, though. Caldwell and Price, big firm out of Chicago. They flew in this morning, which tells me the Vance family is taking this seriously. Chen gestured them inside, lowering his voice. Listen carefully, Sophie. When you're on the stand, stick to facts. Don't editorialize, don't get emotional if you can help it. Just tell the judge what happened, the relationship, the control, the threats, the aftermath. Warner's smart enough to connect the dots. The courthouse was older, built in an era when civic buildings were designed to inspire awe and intimidate wrongdoers. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, the faint smell of old paper and furniture polish. Sophie felt small walking through it, conscious of her borrowed clothes and the fact that her entire life was about to be dissected by strangers. They settled in a small conference room to wait, Chen reviewing his notes while Ethan maintained his quiet vigilance by the door. Sophie tried to calm her racing heart, tried to remember Chen's advice about facts and composure. At 1:30, Sheriff Grant arrived with a thick folder of evidence. Got everything documented. The diner incident, the surveillance photos, the texts, photos from the break-in. Also got Mitchell's statement from lockup. He's not talking much, but he admitted he and Reynolds were hired for surveillance work. Wouldn't say by who, but the implication's clear. That's huge. Chen's eyes lit up. Even without naming Vance Security, that admission establishes a pattern. Someone hired them to watch Sophie, they escalated to assault and stalking, add in the text from Marcus and the break-in, and we've got a compelling narrative. At 1:45, they moved into the courtroom. Sophie's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. The room was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate. Judge Warner's bench dominated one end, the witness stand to its right. Tables for both parties faced the judge, separated by an aisle that felt like a chasm. And then Marcus walked in. Sophie's breath stopped. She hadn't seen him in over a year, had spent that time trying to erase his image from her memory. But there he was, tall, handsome in an expensive suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression one of wounded confusion. The mask he wore in public, the face he showed the world when he wanted them to see a good man wronged by an unstable woman. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Marcus smiled, a small private thing that said he knew exactly what this was doing to her, that he was enjoying her fear. Sophie looked away, focused on Chen, on the solid presence of Ethan beside her in the gallery. Reminded herself that she wasn't alone this time, that she had allies and evidence and the truth on her side. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elizabeth Warner. Warner was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She surveyed the courtroom with the expression of someone who'd seen every trick and wouldn't tolerate nonsense in her domain. Be seated. We're here for an emergency protective order petition, Moore versus Vance. Mr. Chen, you filed on behalf of the petitioner? Yes, Your Honor. Chen stood, his posture confident. We're seeking an immediate protective order against Marcus Vance based on a pattern of stalking, harassment, and escalating threats against my client, Sophie Moore. I've reviewed your filing and the response from Mr. Vance's counsel. This is going to be a he said, she said situation, Mr. Chen. I hope you have more than allegations. We do, Your Honor. Substantial documentary evidence and witness testimony. Warner nodded. Then let's proceed. Call your first witness. Sophie took the stand on shaking legs, her hand trembling as she swore to tell the truth. From this vantage point, she could see Marcus clearly, could see his lawyers, two men in identical expensive suits with expressions of professional skepticism, could see Ethan in the gallery, his steady gaze anchoring her. Chen approached the stand, his manner gentle but purposeful. Ms. Moore, please tell the court about your relationship with Marcus Vance. Sophie took a breath, found her voice. We dated for 18 months. It started well. He was charming, attentive. But gradually he became controlling. He tracked my phone, questioned my friendships, isolated me from family. When I tried to set boundaries, he'd guilt me, tell me I was being paranoid or ungrateful. Can you give specific examples? He installed tracking software on my phone without my knowledge. I found it 6 months into the relationship. When I confronted him, he said it was for my safety, that the city was dangerous. He made me feel guilty for being upset about it. What else? Sophie's throat tightened, but she pushed through. He controlled my schedule, needed to know where I was at all times. If I went anywhere without telling him first, he'd show up. At work, at the grocery store, at my friend's apartment. He said it was because he loved me, because he worried, but it felt like surveillance. Did this escalate? Yes. He started making decisions for me. What jobs I could take, what clothes I could wear, who I could see. And when I finally told him I was leaving, he threatened me, said I'd never really get away, that he'd always know where I was. One of Marcus's lawyers, Caldwell, from the nameplate on his table, stood. Objection, Your Honor. This is all hearsay and subjective interpretation. Ms. Moore is painting a picture of normal relationship concerns as abuse. Warner's gaze was sharp. Overruled. This is a protective order hearing, Mr. Caldwell, not a criminal trial. Ms. Moore's testimony about her own experience is admissible. Continue, Mr. Chen. Chen walked Sophie through the rest, leaving Marcus, the denied restraining order in Chicago, moving 3 times, landing in Riverdale. The incident at the diner with Reynolds and Mitchell, the surveillance photos found on Mitchell's phone. And then what happened, Ms. Moore? I received texts from unknown numbers, different phones, but all with the same message. Marcus telling me he'd found me, that we needed to talk face to face. I blocked each number, but more kept coming. Chen pulled up the texts on a screen, displaying them for the court. Marcus's words preserved in digital amber, undeniable proof of contact. Your Honor, these texts were sent from burner phones purchased with cash. We have store surveillance showing a man matching Mr. Vance's description purchasing 3 of these phones in Chicago the day before the texts were sent. Caldwell stood again. Objection. You can't prove the man in those blurry surveillance images is my client. I'm getting to that. Chen's smile was thin. Ms. Moore, what happened after you received these texts? My apartment was broken into. Someone forced the door, destroyed everything, and left a message on my mirror. You can't hide from me. We will talk, soon. Sophie's voice cracked on the last word, the memory of that violation still fresh. Chen submitted photos of the destruction, of the message scrawled in lipstick. The courtroom was silent as Warner studied them, her expression hardening. Mr. Chen, can you connect this break-in to Mr. Vance? Not directly, Your Honor, but I can establish a pattern. Ms. Moore receives threatening texts from her ex-boyfriend. Days later, her apartment is destroyed with a message that echoes those texts. And we have testimony from the arresting officer about Reynolds and Mitchell's surveillance operation. Chen called Sheriff Grant next, who testified about the diner incident, about Reynolds' criminal record, about Mitchell's admission that they'd been hired for surveillance, about the break-in and the professional nature of the forced entry. Then Ethan took the stand, and Sophie watched Marcus's expression shift, recognition of a different kind of threat, man to man. Mr. Cole, please describe what you witnessed at Maggie's Place diner. Ethan's voice was calm, factual. 2 men approached Mrs. Moore at the counter. Their body language was aggressive, threatening. One grabbed her wrist when she tried to disengage. I intervened to prevent what I assessed as an imminent assault. You have training in threat assessment? 12 years Naval Special Warfare. I'm trained to evaluate and neutralize threats. Ethan's eyes never left Caldwell. Those men weren't there by accident. They'd been watching Ms. Moore for weeks, following her, documenting her movements. That's not random harassment. That's systematic stalking, likely commissioned by someone with resources. Objection! Caldwell was on his feet. Speculation. Mr. Cole has no evidence my client commissioned anything. Sustained. Warner's tone was sharp. Mr. Cole, stick to what you observed directly. Yes, Your Honor. Ethan's expression didn't change. What I observed was 2 men who'd been conducting surveillance on a woman who then attempted to physically restrain her when she resisted contact. That's assault and stalking. And the fact that someone posted their bail within hours of arrest suggests they had backing from an organization with significant resources. But Caldwell cross-examined, trying to paint Ethan as a vigilante, as someone with a personal interest in Sophie that clouded his judgment. But Ethan deflected every attempt with the same calm precision he'd used against Reynolds, giving nothing away. When it was Marcus's turn, his lawyers called him to the stand. Sophie watched him settle in, watched him adopt the expression of wounded sincerity that had fooled so many people for so long. Mr. Vance, do you know why we're here today? Because my ex-girlfriend is making false accusations to harass me. Marcus's voice was smooth, reasonable. Sophie and I had a difficult breakup. She wanted more commitment than I was ready for, and when I ended things, she became fixated. She's been trying to contact me for months, and when I finally responded to her messages, she twisted it into stalking. The lie was so smooth, so polished, that for a moment Sophie felt reality shift. Was that how it had happened? Had she been the pursuer, the unstable one? But then she looked at the evidence on Chen's table, the texts, the photos, the documentation of systematic stalking, and remembered the truth. Mr. Vance, can you explain these text messages sent from burner phones to Miss Moore? I don't know anything about those. Anyone could have sent them. Sophie has a history of fabricating evidence when she doesn't get her way. Do you know Reynolds and Mitchell, the men arrested for stalking Ms. Moore? I've never heard of them. And your father's company, Vance Security Solutions, do they employ private investigators? My father's business has nothing to do with this. Marcus's mask slipped slightly, irritation bleeding through. This is a desperate attempt by a vindictive woman to damage my reputation. Chen let him talk, let him build his defense of wounded innocence. Then he pulled out one more piece of evidence, a phone record from one of the burner phones, showing calls to a number registered to Vance Security Solutions. Mr. Vance, if you know nothing about these burner phones, how do you explain calls from one of them to your father's company? Marcus's face went pale. That could be anyone. Coincidence. Quite a coincidence. A burner phone used to threaten Ms. Moore calls your father's security firm, and days later men with ties to private investigation assault her. All coincidence? Objection! Caldwell was furious now. This is speculation and innuendo, not evidence. But the damage was done. Sophie could see Warner's expression, could see the judge connecting dots that Marcus's expensive lawyers couldn't erase. Warner called a brief recess, and Sophie collapsed in the conference room, adrenaline crash hitting hard. Ethan was there immediately, a steady hand on her shoulder. You did good, really good. Warner sees through his lies. But what if she doesn't grant it? What if... Then we appeal, and we keep fighting. But Sophie, look at the evidence we presented. Look at how Marcus's story fell apart under questioning. We've got this. Chen returned, his expression cautiously optimistic. Warner's reviewing everything. Could go either way, but I think we made our case. That phone record linking the burner to VSS, that's the smoking gun we needed. When they returned to the courtroom, Warner's expression was stern, unreadable. Sophie's heart hammered as she waited for the words that would determine her future. I've reviewed the evidence and testimony. This is a troubling case. Troubling because of the pattern of behavior demonstrated, and troubling because of the sophisticated nature of the alleged stalking. Warner's gaze swept the courtroom. Mr. Vance, your testimony was polished but inconsistent with the documentary evidence. The phone records, the texts, the timing of the break-in, all of it points to systematic harassment of Ms. Moore. Marcus's lawyers started to object, but Warner silenced them with a look. I'm granting the emergency protective order. Mr. Vance, you are hereby prohibited from any contact with Miss Moore. No calls, no texts, no in-person contact, no third-party contact. You must stay at least 500 feet away from her residence, workplace, and any location where she's known to be. This order is effective immediately and will remain in place pending a full hearing in 30 days. Sophie felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. Relief? Vindication. The first real breath she'd taken in over a year. Furthermore, Warner continued, her voice hard, I'm referring this case to the Illinois Attorney General's office for investigation into possible violations of interstate stalking laws. Mr. Caldwell, I suggest your client and his father's company prepare for scrutiny. This court does not tolerate stalking, and the evidence suggests criminal behavior that goes beyond civil protective orders. Marcus's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. Sophie watched him, watched the moment he realized he'd lost, that his money and lawyers and family connections hadn't been enough to override the truth. Court is adjourned. Outside, Sophie broke down completely, sobbing into Ethan's shoulder while Chen made phone calls and Grant coordinated with Chicago PD. Everything she'd been holding together for months came pouring out. The fear, the exhaustion, the bone-deep relief of finally being heard, believed, protected. You did it, Ethan murmured against her hair. You stood up to him and you won. We did it. I couldn't have done this alone. Maybe not, but you were brave enough to try, brave enough to keep fighting when everything told you to run. That's all you, Sophie. I just provided backup. They stayed at the courthouse until the protective order was officially filed and served. Marcus left flanked by his lawyers, his expression promising that this wasn't over. But it was. Sophie could feel it. Warner's referral to the Attorney General meant real consequences, meant Marcus would spend the next months dealing with federal investigators instead of tormenting her. That night, back at Ethan's house, Sophie helped make dinner while Lily chattered about her day at school. Normal, domestic, peaceful. Everything she'd been fighting for crystallized in this moment of safety and belonging. After Lily was in bed, Sophie and Ethan sat on the back porch, watching stars emerge in the autumn sky. What happens now? Ethan asked quietly. Now I rebuild. For real this time, not just hiding, but actually building a life. Sophie pulled Mr. Trunk closer, the elephant a reminder of how far she'd come. I'll need to find a new apartment, replace everything that was destroyed, get back to my work, my clients. You could stay here for a while until you get sorted. He said it casually, but Sophie heard the hope underneath. Lily would love it. And honestly, I would too. Sophie looked at him, this man who'd become her unexpected anchor. That's a big step. We barely know each other. We know enough. We know we work together, that we trust each other. The rest we can figure out as we go. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm not asking for promises or commitment. I'm just saying you don't have to face the rebuilding alone. You've got us, if you want us. Sophie thought about the guest room that had become a sanctuary, about Lily's laughter and Ethan's steady presence, about the difference between a man who loved by controlling and a man who loved by standing beside, supporting without possessing. I want you, she said softly. Both of you. But Ethan, I need time. I need to figure out who I am outside of survival mode, outside of defining myself by what I'm running from. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. We'll be here when you're ready, whether that's tomorrow or 6 months from now. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of healing and rebuilding. The Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Vance Security Solutions, and suddenly Marcus was the one being scrutinized, his family's business under federal review. Reynolds went back to jail on violating bail conditions. Mitchell cut a deal and testified against VSS in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sophie found a new apartment, smaller than her last place, but with better security and a landlord who understood her situation. She replaced her destroyed equipment, rebuilt her client base, slowly reclaimed the career she'd put on hold while running. But most nights she ended up at Ethan's house, helping with dinner, reading to Lily before bed, sitting on the porch with Ethan discussing everything and nothing, learning what it felt like to be part of something without losing herself in the process. 3 months after the protective order was granted, Dr. Brennan asked Sophie a question that stopped her cold. When you think about Marcus now, what do you feel? Sophie considered this, probing the old wound like checking a healing injury. Anger, sometimes. Frustration that he stole so much of my time, my peace. But mostly I feel free. Like he doesn't get to define my story anymore. He's just a chapter I survived, not the whole book. That's significant growth, Sophie. When you started therapy, you couldn't even say his name without panic attacks. I know. I'm not all the way healed. Maybe I never will be. But I'm better. I'm myself again. Or maybe a new version of myself. Someone stronger. Someone who knows her worth. One Saturday in early spring, Sophie woke in her apartment to sun streaming through windows and a text from Lily, laboriously typed with help from her father. Pancake breakfast at our house. Come now. Dad says bring Mr. Trunk. Sophie smiled, dressed quickly, grabbed the elephant that had become a talisman of this new chapter. Drove through Riverdale's familiar streets to the house that felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived in years. Ethan answered the door in flour-dusted jeans, his hair sticking up at angles, Lily bouncing at his side in her pajamas. We're making chocolate chip pancakes, and Daddy let me crack the eggs, and I only got a little bit of shell in there. Lily grabbed Sophie's hand, tugging her toward the kitchen. Come on, you have to help, because Daddy's terrible at making them into shapes, and I want mine to look like hearts. The morning dissolved into flour and laughter and pancakes that looked more like abstract art than hearts. They ate at the table, Lily monopolizing the conversation with plans for her upcoming birthday party, while Ethan and Sophie exchanged amused glances over her head. After breakfast, Lily dragged Sophie outside to see her garden, a small plot where she'd planted seeds with Ethan's help, waiting for spring to coax them into bloom. Daddy says gardens need patience and love and water, just like people. Lily said this with the solemn wisdom of someone repeating an important lesson. He says you were like a seed that needed somewhere safe to grow, and now you're growing beautiful. Sophie's throat closed. She looked up to find Ethan watching from the porch, his expression soft. Your daddy's a smart man, she managed. Later, after Lily was absorbed in her coloring books, Sophie joined Ethan on the porch. They sat in comfortable silence, watching spring unfold across Riverdale. Trees budding, flowers emerging, the world renewing itself after winter. I've been thinking, Sophie said finally, about what you said, about taking time to figure out who I am outside of survival mode. Yeah? Ethan's voice was carefully neutral. I think I've figured some of it out. I'm someone who designs beautiful things, someone who loves small-town mornings and chocolate chip pancakes, someone who believes in second chances and new beginnings." She paused, gathered courage. "And someone who's ready to stop treating this, us, like it's temporary." Ethan turned to face her fully, hope and caution warring in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to be here, not as a guest, not as someone hiding from danger, but as someone building a life with you and Lily. If you'll have me." "If I'll have you?" His laugh was slightly shaky. "Sophie, I've been waiting months for you to realize you already belong here, that you've been part of this family since Lily handed you Mr. Trunk and decided you were ours to protect. So that's a yes?" "That's a yes to whatever you want. Dating, moving in, taking it slow, figuring it out as we go. As long as you're here, the details don't matter." Sophie leaned in, closed the distance between them, and kissed him. It was gentle, tentative, nothing like the passionate embraces in movies. It was better. It was real, built on trust and respect, and the slow accumulation of shared moments that had transformed strangers into family. When they pulled apart, Lily was standing in the doorway. Mr. Trunk clutched to her chest, a smile stretching across her face. "Does this mean Miss Sophie is staying forever? Because I already made her a drawing for her room, and I didn't want to give it to her if she was going to leave." Sophie laughed, tears streaming down her face. Happy tears this time, healing tears. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm staying." "Good." Lily launched herself at both adults, wrapping her small arms around them. "Because we're a family now, Daddy and me and you and Mr. Trunk. That's what families do. They stay together." And there, on a spring morning in Riverdale, Sophie understood that Lily was right. Family wasn't just about blood or legal documents. It was about people who stood by you when the world fell apart, who offered safety without possession, who loved you enough to let you find yourself before asking you to build something new. Marcus sent one final text 6 months later, from yet another burner phone. "You think you've won, but you'll never really be free of me." Sophie showed it to Ethan, watched him make the call to Grant to document it for the ongoing federal case. Then she deleted it, blocked the number, and went back to the life she was building, the design business that was thriving, the home she'd made in Ethan's house, the little girl who called her Sophie Mom in unguarded moments. Marcus was wrong. She was free. Not because he'd stopped trying to control her, the occasional text proved he hadn't, but because he no longer had power over her choices, her peace, her future. She was free because she'd chosen to stand and fight instead of run, because she'd let good people stand with her, because she'd learned that strength wasn't about never needing help. It was about being brave enough to accept it when offered. On a golden Saturday morning, almost a year after the protective order was granted, Sophie stood in Maggie's diner holding Lily's hand, Ethan's arm warm around her shoulders. They'd come for their usual breakfast, the Saturday tradition that had evolved from chance meeting to cherished ritual. The diner was full of familiar faces, Carol and Jim from the bookstore, Sheriff Grant stopping in for coffee, Mrs. Chen with her grandchildren. People who'd watched Sophie's story unfold, who'd offered quiet support and loud defense when she needed it most. Maggie herself brought over their usual orders without asking, her weathered face creased with satisfaction. "Look at you three, practically glowing with contentment. Does my heart good to see it." "Thanks to you, Maggie." Sophie meant it. "This is where it started, where I learned there were still good people willing to stand up for strangers. You weren't a stranger for long, honey. This town has a way of claiming people who belong here." Maggie patted Lily's head fondly. "And this little one made sure you knew you were ours." They ate breakfast in the warm chaos of Maggie's. Lily chattering about her upcoming dance recital, Ethan interjecting commentary that made Sophie laugh, the three of them woven together by 1,000 small moments into something that felt permanent and true. And when they walked out into Riverdale's autumn sunshine, their hands linked together, Ethan's, Sophie's, and Lily's in the middle, Sophie understood that this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic courtroom declarations or Marcus finally leaving her alone, though those mattered too. Victory was this: Saturday morning pancakes and a child's laughter, and a man who'd taught her that protection could be partnership, that love could be freedom, that home wasn't a place you found, but people who chose to build it with you. In Riverdale, Ethan Cole wasn't a legend or a warrior or a man defined by the violence he'd learned and chosen to set aside. He was simply a father who protected his whole world, and Sophie had become part of that world, essential and cherished and safe. Not because danger no longer existed. It did, would always exist in some form. But because she'd stopped running from it alone. She'd found her people, claimed her place, built her life on foundations of trust and courage, and the stubborn refusal to let her past dictate her future. Marcus Vance no longer got to write her story. That power belonged to Sophie now, and she was writing something beautiful,